Hi guys, tonight we ease into a snowbound frontier where your breath feels like tiny crystals in the air and the boards beneath your boots complain with every cold step. You stand in the middle of a wild western winter, the kind that creaks through shutters, slides along the seams of your coat and whispers that you probably will not survive this if you're not paying attention. The cold out here has a personality. It presses into you the moment the sun dips, and it does not let up until spring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to be part of tonight's little experiment, go ahead and tell me your location and your local time, because I love knowing where you're drifting off from. Now dim the lights and follow your own footprints deeper into this world as the narration folds quietly around you. You trudge forward through knee-high snow that sparkles like ground glass under the moon. The air stings the inside of your nose the instant you inhale, and you can feel the tiny hairs inside your nostrils freeze. You know you should not be out here long, not with the wind slicing across the open plain, but this is your introduction to how people in the Old West learned to exist in conditions that would send most modern-day folks scrambling for a hotel app. The first lesson is simple. Winter on this frontier was not a season. It was an adversary. Every chore, every building decision, every night's rest hinged on how well you could keep the cold from worming its way into your bones. The cabin ahead of you waits like a squat, dark promise of relief. It looks small, almost temporary, but that was the reality of early settlement. People built fast and slept rough. They did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect materials or perfect conditions. A mainstream historical fact often cited is that many frontier cabins were thrown up in a matter of days, sometimes even a single day, whenever settlers had to claim land before someone else did. No time for decorative touches, no time for careful sealing. Gaps between logs might be stuffed with moss or mud or whatever else was at hand, but the structure never fully stopped the wind. You feel that truth the moment you step onto the porch. The boards tremble slightly under your weight and a cold draught leaks under the door like a ghost that forgot to knock. Inside you meet your first moment of real frontier nighttime, the thin boundary between cold and comfort. The fire in the stone hearth has been coaxed into a steady glow. Its light flickers across the room and casts shadows that look like animals stretching. You lower yourself onto a rough wooden stool, your gloved hands hovering as close to the warmth as you dare. The scent of smoke lingers in the air. Not the clean fireplace smell that modern cabins advertise, but something harsher, sometimes almost sour, as if the chimney and the room have been battling each other. Historians still argue whether these early cabins represented rugged innovation or sheer desperation. Some insist that settlers were remarkably adaptable, drawing on techniques they had seen in eastern woodlands or borrowed from indigenous neighbours. Others point out that many cabins fell apart within a few winters so poorly constructed that the families inside slept with snow drifting onto their quilts. The truth is often both. Ingenuity and chaos living side by side, much like the families who built these shelters in a hurry. As you warm your fingers, your eyes adjust to the interior. The room is barely larger than a modern garden shed. One bed occupies an entire corner covered with quilts, so heavy that you imagine it takes two hands to lift a single edge. A quirky tidbit you might not expect is that some frontier families slept with their boots wrapped at the foot of the bed so they would not freeze solid by morning. Boots could become rigid as planks in a cabin without long hours of heat. Imagine waking up and trying to cram your foot into footwear that behaves like carved wood. Not ideal. The single window has frost feathers branching across the inside of the glass like pale ferns, patterns forming themselves through the night. Outside, the wind whistles along the cabin walls and you can hear the sound of loose snow skittering like sand. Inside, the temperature is slightly above freezing, just enough to thaw your face and let your shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. You can almost feel the sleepiness that comes after a long winter day in the 19th century. A day where merely existing was a full workload. You take off your gloves and flex your fingers. There is no insulation in the cabin, except for what the family built by hand. strips of cloth stuffed in cracks, mud dried into seams, even dried cow manure sometimes used as filler when resources ran low. It was not glamorous, but it worked well enough for a season or two. You run your hand along the interior wall and feel every ridge of bark and every channel of cold that has sneaked through. In the quiet, you realize something else. People who lived in these conditions did not sleep the way modern people do. 8 hours uninterrupted would have sounded like a fairy tale. Nights were broken by fire maintenance animal checks and the shivers that came when the cabin temperature dipped closer to the outside. Frontier diaries describe waking several times to feed the fire or to knock ice out of water buckets kept near the hearth. It is startling to imagine, but yes, the water indoors froze unless kept practically on top of the flames. You hear a soft groan as the roof beams respond to the temperature shift, expanding and contracting with loud wooden sighs. Another detail that shaped frontier sleep patterns. Noises in the night were not merely background ambience. People listened to them with an almost instinctive awareness. A pop in the rafters might mean the beams needed reinforcing. A sudden shift in wind could signal a new storm rolling in from the north. A muffled thump outside could be an animal, or worse, a sign that drifting snow was piling up against the cabin door. You step away from the fire and cross the room to the bed. The quilts are thick with hand stitching. Wool cotton scraps and sometimes layers of old clothing repurposed into warmth. You feel the weight when you press your hand onto them. It is grounding, heavy in a way that pins you to the mattress not uncomfortably but with a sense of enforced stillness. Sleep in the West was not about softness. It was about conserving heat, conserving energy, conserving the will to get through tomorrow. You lower yourself onto the edge of the bed and the straw-filled tick beneath you whispers with each movement. It is lumpy and uneven, but surprisingly warm once your body begins to settle. You close your eyes for a breath. The warmth of the fire fades slightly, replaced by the more personal warmth of piled quilts and shared body heat. You do not stay long. There is an entire journey ahead, and this is only your introduction. Outside, the wind picks up again. Inside, the flames shift their glow, pulsing like a sleepy heartbeat. You stand pulling your coat close, ready to step back into the cold that rules the frontier night. This is the world you're entering. A world where survival and sleep walk hand in hand, and you have only just begun to learn the rhythm of its winter breath. You step back outside, and the air reminds you instantly that the frontier does not negotiate. The wind cuts across your cheeks with a sharpness that feels almost personal, as if the land itself is testing you. The cabin you just left sits behind you like a fragile lantern in a world carved from ice. Ahead lies another truth about winter life in the Old West. People often had to throw their shelters together fast without hesitation, and with very little regard for elegance. You walk toward a clearing where another family has been working through the short daylight hours, stacking logs in a rhythm that sounds like a heartbeat. You already feel snow gathering on your collar as you arrive at the edge of their work site. The first thing you notice is the urgency. These people are not building a dream house. They are building a barrier between themselves and the cold. Each log is lifted with the kind of focus that comes from fear mixed with determination. They are racing sundown because once the temperature drops, fingers stiffen and the simplest mistakes can become dangerous. A mainstream historical fact worth noting is that many settlers built their first cabin within 48 hours of arriving at a homestead. Some even managed to erect the walls in a single day if the family or community was large enough. The priority was not beauty, it was survival before dark. You watch as they notch logs by hand. The sound is rough and rhythmic, each strike of the axe or adze echoing into the trees. The timber smells sharp and raw, and the scent mixes with the distant odour of smoke from an older cabin nearby. You can taste pine resin on the air. You stand close enough to warm your gloved hands from the friction of their labour, but not so close as to disrupt the fragile choreography of building. Every movement has a purpose. Every wasted second means deeper cold and shallower sleep. The structure takes shape quickly, but that speed comes at a cost. There are gaps between logs, not small gaps. Gaps wide enough for moonlight to pass through like thin silver blades. You watch one of the builders press his palm to a seam and you can see his glove flutter from the wind pushing through. He shakes his head, mutters something you cannot hear, and reaches for a bundle of dried grass to stuff between the timbers. The cold creeps through every crack anyway. A quirky tidbit sometimes mentioned in frontier letters is that children were often put in charge of running around outside the cabin, stuffing mud moss or even bits of clothing into open spaces when the wind got too aggressive. The work was never fully done. The wind always found a new angle. As night grows closer, the family pauses to test the structure. They stand inside the half-finished cabin and the father calls out toward one wall. The mother stands outside and listens. If she can hear him clearly, she knows they have more work to do. Tonight you hear the faint echo of his words pass through the timbers like a whisper. They all groan in unison, the same way modern families groan at a dead phone battery. More chinking, more stuffing, more hoping. Historians still debate whether these fast-built cabins represented clever frontier adaptation or simply helpless reaction to circumstance. Some researchers argue that settlers were recreating European or Eastern building traditions, trusting that rough log structures would hold firm. Others insist these cabins were barely functional, acting more like temporary windbreaks than real homes. You stand inside this one, its walls only shoulder height so far, and feel both interpretations lingering in the cold air. The settlers are doing the best they can with what they have, but the wind remains unimpressed. You step forward to help hold a log as they position it. Your hands sink into the bark, rough and splintering, and your arms shake slightly with the weight. The world around you is quiet except for the sounds of the build. No cars, no generators, no hum of distant traffic. Only the muffled presence of snow and the occasional croak of a raven perched overhead. The cabin begins to feel like a small ship battling through a white ocean, its log ribs creaking under strain. When the final log of the evening is set in place, the family turns their attention to the roof frame. They lash poles together and lay branches across the top. That will hold until tomorrow, when more durable material can be added. For tonight, the goal is simply to trap enough warmth to allow sleep. You watch as they step inside again. The mother stands near the centre, rubbing her arms, while the father lights a small lantern that throws a weak, blurry glow over the rough walls. The children have already begun moving bedding inside. Straw blankets, quilts, anything that promises insulation. The bedding rustles with a texture that makes you think of autumn leaves. They arrange it in a heap, not a neat bed. Neatness is for better seasons. Tonight is about stacking warmth in layers like sediment. You crouch near the makeshift pile and feel heat rising weakly from the flattened straw. Your breath forms little clouds that drift toward the lantern and dissolve. A sudden gust presses against the cabin and the entire structure shivers. Snow sifts down through an opening in the roof. The mother sighs and brushes it off the bedding with the back of her hand. This will be their night. A half-finished home, a restless wind, and the hope that morning will arrive without a storm. The children lie down early, burrowing into the quilts like small animals seeking the centre of a burrow. The parents sit on the edge of the bedding, discussing chores for tomorrow with low voices. You understand what that means. Winter forced families into a constant planning mode. Every choice had consequences. Your feet begin to cool again, and you realise how much warmth comes from proximity to other bodies. Even in this half-made cabin, the temperature rises slightly as the family huddles together. You feel the heat of their breath, the weight of their exhaustion, and the small comfort they take in simply having walls, even imperfect ones. It gives you a better sense of what winter nights were like in the West. Fragile shelters in endless cold. You step outside into the deepening twilight. Behind you the lantern flickers inside the cabin, soft and steady. Ahead the land stretches open and pale as bone. Tomorrow this family will pack more mud into the seams. They will reinforce the roof. They will adjust, adapt and endure. But tonight they sleep lightly. They sleep knowing that every gust of wind might find a new crack to slip through. You pull your collar up and take one last look at the rough, unfinished shelter. Then you walk forward into the snow, carrying with you the humbling reminder that comfort was always a negotiation out here, and sometimes a losing battle. You move away from the half-finished cabin and into a darker patch of woods where snow lies deeper and sound travels slower. Here the cold settles in layers almost like invisible blankets of different temperatures. Each step presses your boots into snow that gives a soft crunch, then a muted hiss as the top crust breaks. Ahead is another frontier home older than the one you just left, shaped by seasons of improvisation. This is your chance to understand what people actually slept on during ice-gripped winters, because bedding was not a luxury item. It was a survival tool that decided how much heat your body could hold when everything around you wanted to steal it. You approach a low-roof cabin that looks worn but lived in. Thin wisps of smoke rise from the stovepipe and drift sideways in the wind. That little plume hints at life inside. You open the wooden door and slip into a room warm enough to fog your breath. The interior smells of wool pine and faint animal musk. It is not unpleasant. It is simply the smell of people doing what they must to stay alive. The family inside glances up at you, offering a tired smile, and you nod back. You have stepped into another lesson on bedding frontier style. Against the wall you see the first layer of sleep, a straw tick stuffed so full it looks like a loaf of rising bread. You kneel next to it and press your palm into the surface. The straw shifts with a dry whisper and the mattress springs back unevenly. A mainstream historical fact is that most frontier mattresses were simple ticks filled with straw hay or dried grass replaced seasonally when the material broke down or became too full of dust and insects. Feather beds did exist, but they were rare luxuries often brought west by wealthier migrants or inherited from family back east. Most people slept on what the land provided. The tick sits on a frame made from rough split logs lashed together with strips of rawhide. The frame creaks when you put your weight on it. The sound echoes lightly in the small room. You lift one corner of the mattress and see a stack of quilts folded beneath. Layers upon layers. From a distance they look decorative, but up close you recognise them as patchwork born from necessity. Torn shirts, worn petticoats, bits of canvas, wool, scraps, even pieces of old grain sacks. Nothing was wasted. Heat mattered too much. The mother invites you to feel the quilts. They are heavier than you expect. When you drape one over your arm, it settles with a dense weight, as if it has absorbed years of winter nights. You run your fingers across the fabric and trace the uneven stitches. Some are tight and straight. Others wander like little rivers. This is not an aesthetic choice. It is a record of hands that sewed late into the night, repairing what kept the cold from chewing at their bones. A quirky little detail the father mentions quietly is that some families stuffed bits of dried herbs between quilt layers. Not for warmth, but to repel insects or simply make the bedding smell less like livestock. Lavender if they had it. Sage if that was all that grew. Even crushed juniper sometimes found its way into sleep. You imagine drifting off with that clean, sharp scent around you, and understand why people tried anything that offered a hint of comfort. You shift your attention to the pelts piled along the far wall. Heavy buffalo robes stacked like folded thunderclouds. Deer hides tanned soft and supple. A large bear pelt spread across the foot of the bed, its fur deep and glossy, almost black in the lantern light. You touch the buffalo robe first. It is thick enough to feel like a natural furnace, the woolly underlayer soft despite its rugged appearance. These robes were prized. They were warm even when damp, and they trapped body heat with surprising efficiency. Historians still debate whether settlers adopted buffalo robes from Indigenous influence or purchased them through trade networks without fully understanding the techniques behind their creation. Many researchers point to the deep knowledge Indigenous communities held about tanning and hide preparation. Others suggest that settlers simply followed practical necessity, using whatever kept them warm regardless of origin. You look at the robe in your hands and sense that multiple truths exist here. Knowledge blended on the frontier more often than people admit. You try lying down on the straw tick. The bedding rustles beneath you, filling your ears with a soft crackle. The quilts press down, gently making you feel cocooned rather than pinned. The pelt placed across your midsection radiates warmth instantly. It is not the light, breathable warmth of a modern comforter. It is an earthy, grounding heat that holds you still, almost like being tucked into the landscape itself. You can feel how quickly your core temperature begins to stabilize. Out here, that stability could mean the difference between waking refreshed or waking numb in the fingertips. The fire crackles in the corner, offering its own steady heartbeat. But you notice something else. This family has placed heated stones near the bedding wrapped in cloth and tucked between quilts earlier in the evening. They have cooled now, but still give off faint warmth. This small detail is the kind of trick that becomes a nightly ritual in a climate like this. Heat the stones during dinner. Wrap them while they are still too hot to touch directly. Slip them into the bed to warm the space before anyone climbs in. You imagine the children racing to claim the warmest spot. The father shows you another bedding tactic. He lifts a long woven rug from the wall and flips it onto the floor beside the bed. Wall hangings were not just decorative. They blocked drafts, absorbed cold, and made nighttime a little more bearable. Some families hung quilts on walls for the same reason. The cabin might still feel chilly, but at least the cold was slowed down. You find yourself imagining how much colder the room would feel if the wooden logs were bare. As you sit back up, a faint rattling noise comes from the rafters. The mother laughs softly and explains that it is the sound of ice forming on the roof cracking as the cabin warms from inside. That rustle and pop may seem eerie to outsiders, but people grew used to it. It was simply part of winter. Another reminder that the cold was never more than a few inches away. You understand why bedding had to be thick-layered and reliable. The room itself could not hold warmth, so the bedding had to. You watch the children prepare for bed. They slip into woolen nightshirts and thick socks. They brush snowflakes off their shoulders from the quick run outside to dump wash water before it froze in the bucket. They crawl under the quilts without hesitation, burrowing toward the centre where warmth collects most quickly. The bare pelt is pulled up over them. Their eyes droop even before the mother finishes tucking the edges in place. You take one last look at the bedding arrangement. Straw tick for elevation and insulation. Cloth quilts to trap heat. Heavy pelts to lock it all in. Heated stones to jump-start the warmth. Each layer working like a team in a quiet battle against winter. You step back toward the door, the warmth clinging to you like a memory. When you step outside again, the cold sweeps across your face. It steals your breath for a second before you recover. You glance back at the window where a soft orange glow seeps through the frost. Inside, the family sleeps wrapped in warmth. They built with their own hands. You continue down the path, your breath swirling into the night, already wondering what the next piece of frontier winter survival will reveal. You follow the faint glow of another homestead, the light flickering through grooved shutters, as if it is shivering in time with the cold. The snow groans under your boots. That sound feels older than the frontier itself, as though generations before you have trudged through the same frozen hush. You approach a squat cabin built sturdier than the others you've seen, and even from outside you can hear the crackle of a fire that refuses to sleep. Tonight you're stepping into the world of hearth tending, because out here a fire was not a pleasant evening accessory. It was the living core of the home, the heartbeat that kept every soul inside from freezing stiff. You push the door open, and the warmth washes over you like a gentle wave. The interior is dim, golden, and softly breathing with firelight. The hearth dominates the room, large enough that you could imagine a grown man curling up inside if he were desperate. The stonework rises shoulder high, and the mantel is carved with little notches where hands have rested for years. Someone built this with more care than the quick cabins you visited earlier, and you can feel that intention in every radiating ember. A mother sits close to the hearth on a three-legged stool. Her eyes are half closed and her fingers work methodically as she adjusts a pot simmering over the coals. You take a moment to listen. The fire sounds almost like applause, soft and rhythmic, celebrating the fact that it still lives. In many frontier diaries, people mention that they kept their fires going all winter, refusing to let them die even once, because rekindling from scratch could be miserable in the cold. This detail is often shared to explain how families measured nights not in hours, but in how many times someone had to shuffle over and poke the fire back to life. You crouch beside the hearth and feel the warmth hit your face in slow pulses. The family explains that someone always stays half awake to tend the flames. Not a full vigil, not a formal watch, but a drifting awareness that keeps ears tuned for the faint hiss that means the fire is losing strength. The father demonstrates how he reaches out with the poker, nudging a log so gently that it looks almost like a gesture of affection. He tells you that the cabin depends on these glowing coals. Without them, everyone inside would wake with frost creeping across the blankets. One of the grandparents already settled in bed rises just enough to show you a scar on his wrist. It is small, silvery and smooth, a reminder of a night decades earlier when the fire died while he slept. He woke before dawn with his arm pressed against a frost-covered wall. Small moments like that shaped how fiercely people protected their hearths. For your nightly trio of required details, you weave them naturally into the firelit room. To begin with, you might notice something noted in many historical accounts. Frontier fireplaces were often built disproportionately large, compared to the cabin size, sometimes taking up an entire wall, because settlers relied on radiant heat rather than insulation. This structural extravagance was not indulgent. It was necessary. While you study the hearth, the mother mentions a little odd practice they follow. She keeps a small bundle of chicken feathers tied near the fireplace stones. You lean closer, and she explains with a quiet smile that when the air at ground level starts to drop too sharply, the feathers begin to flutter. It is a simple early warning system she learned from her own mother. A tiny movement telling them a draft is slipping in, or the fire is weakening. It sounds whimsical, but it works. Meanwhile, the father shakes his head when you ask whether all families followed the same heating practices. Some researchers argue that settlers on the plains and settlers in the mountain regions had vastly different firekeeping strategies. Others insist the habits were surprisingly similar because fear of freezing transcended geography. As you watch the embers shift, you can feel how easy it would be for historians to disagree. There is so little documentation, so much lived experience that never made it into letters or records. The truth is a shadow that flickers with each flame. The children prepare for bed as their mother stirs the fire again. They gather around her like small orbiting moons. One yawns so hard tears form at the corners of his eyes. Another clutches a wooden cup of warm broth. They know that warmth comes from the hearth first, the bedding second, and the rest of the cabin almost never. You watch them take turns warming their hands close to the stones. Their fingers look pink and tender in the firelight. The father shows you their nightly fire ritual. First he adjusts the log placement to ensure slow burning. Then he rakes the glowing coals into a mound and sets a thicker log on top to smoulder through the night. He sprinkles a little ash over the edges of the log, something he learned from a neighbour years ago. A dusting of ash slows. The burn preserves the embers and keeps the cabin warm enough to prevent icy air from taking over the room before dawn. You didn't expect ash to be a tool, but here it is. Frontier wisdom rarely appears in neat packages. The grandparents are already settled beneath quilts in the raised corner bed. They smile faintly as the warmth reaches them. Their breathing slows. You can tell they have lived many winters like this, fires tended with the same rhythm night after night. Their eyes reflect the glow, soft and steady, carrying memories of storms that once sounded like the sky splitting open. They rest now because they trust the family to keep the flames alive. You sit back absorbing the hypnotic quality of firelight. You can hear the faint snap of resin inside the burning wood. The smell is smoky with a hint of sweetness, maybe from the pine. When you shift your weight, the floorboards creak gently, and the warmth rolls toward your feet like a sighing tide. This hearth is the quiet centre of everything in the room. Every conversation, every moment of planning, every breath of comfort happens beside it. Even the cats know where to sleep. A little ginger one curls around a warm stone at the edge of the hearth, purring with absolute satisfaction. You glance toward the window and see snow brushing across the pane in pale streaks. The cold outside looks merciless. Inside, the light pushes it back inch by inch. You begin to understand why people devoted so much effort to keeping this one spot alive. It held the power of survival wrapped in smoke and flame. As the night grows deeper, the mother dims the lantern and leaves the room lit mostly by the fire. You sense the cabin contracting into its nighttime rhythm. Fewer words, more breaths, more soft crackles of settling timber. The hearth glows lower but still strong enough to warm the air. The father settles on a bench where he will drift in and out of sleep, listening for any sign the fire is slipping toward darkness. You take one last lingering breath of the warm smoky air and prepare to step back outside. The fire continues its gentle murmur behind you. You know that while you move on, this family will guard those embers through the long hours ahead. Their night depends on it. When you open the door, the cold greets you instantly, a crisp slap that steals the warmth from your skin. You look back once more at the steady orange glow pulsing in the corner of the room. A reminder that out here, sleep was always intertwined with flame. You pull your coat tighter and continue into the winter silence. You make your way toward a long, narrow cabin perched beside a frozen creek, the moonlight glinting off its roof like a sword edge. The cold squeezes your face as if testing your resolve, and by the time you push the door open, you're grateful for even a hint of warmth. Inside, the glow from a lantern reveals a scene that seems almost universal across the frontier. A bed big enough for 2, possibly 3, squeezed into the corner like a ship's berth. Tonight you are stepping into the world of shared sleeping and nightly compromise born from cold scarcity, and the simple logic that bodies generate more heat together than apart. The straw tick waiting on the bed frame looks familiar by now, but this one is wider, higher, and stuffed with what sounds like a symphony of dried rustles. When you sit on it, the entire mattress hisses in protest, the straw shifting and crunching beneath your weight. You feel the uneven lumps and the way your body sinks slightly toward the centre. The bedding was often renewed each winter if families had the energy and spare materials to do it, and one recorded memory describes settlers shaking out mice nests from old straw before refilling a tick for the season. That image lingers in your mind for a moment before you shift your weight again. The couple who lives here gestures for you to feel the quilts. You lift a corner and feel how they sag with the heaviness of layered wool and patched cotton. Frontier sewing was less about prettiness and more about warmth, yet many families produced quilts that told stories with their scraps. A square cut from a wedding dress next to a piece of a worn work shirt sewn together so tightly that cold would have to fight for any chance of getting through. The weight of the quilt drapes over your arm like a physical reminder that softness was relative in this landscape. As you examine the bedding, you learn something that appears often in frontier recollections. Many households practiced what they called double sleeping, especially during winter. A married couple shared the bed, of course, but children sometimes piled in too, or visiting relatives or even neighbours during storms. Space was limited, heat was precious. It was a practical arrangement rather than a sentimental one. The husband chuckles and tells you that sleeping two to a straw tick has its hazards. He points out the squeaking of the frame, the pressing together of elbows and knees, and the way the centre of the mattress often forms a natural valley that drags sleepers toward each other all night. You shift your seat and can already feel the subtle incline pulling at you. He explains that sometimes they wake with cold noses pressed against warm shoulders, or with their hair dusted lightly with straw. In the spirit of tonight's required trifecta, the wife mentions something grounded in documented experience. Many frontier families placed a board, sometimes called a chimney board, between the bed and the wall to block the freezing drafts that slipped in during the night. Without that barrier, sleepers often awoke to a crust of frost on the quilt edge closest to the wall. You lean closer and realize there is indeed a rough plank wedged behind their bed, forming a crude shield against the nightly icy breath of the cabin. Your attention shifts as she shares a peculiar little habit passed down from her grandmother. Before bed, she sprinkles tiny pinches of crushed mint into the bedding. It is not strong enough to serve as a fragrance in the modern sense, but it offers just enough freshness to counteract the musty smell of winter straw. It also seems to help her sleep. This little domestic ritual feels charming and oddly grounding, a reminder that comfort was earned in small improvised ways. When you ask whether all families slept the same way, the husband shrugs. Some historical researchers claim that communal sleeping arrangements were nearly universal across the frontier, while others argue that privacy mattered more than we assume, and that many families resisted the idea unless absolutely necessary. You can sense how both ideas might hold some truth. The West was not one culture but many, and surviving cold nights required flexibility rather than rigid customs. You lie back tentatively on the straw tick. The bedding crackles beneath you like distant fireworks. The quilts settle heavily over your chest, pulling you downward, with a seriousness that makes it clear you're not meant to toss and turn under them. The heat builds slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the quilts need time to remember how to behave. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine sharing this limited space with someone else. You would sleep tucked tightly, shoulder to shoulder, your breaths mingling in small clouds before fading into the cold air above the bed. Outside, a gust of wind rattles the shutters. Inside the bed frame creaks in sympathy. The wife shows you the rope lattice under the mattress, a web of thick cords tied in a simple crisscross. She presses her palm into the centre, and you hear another creak. Beds like these needed regular tightening. Every few weeks someone had to pull the ropes taut again so the mattress would not sag too deeply. She hands you a wooden tool used for twisting the ropes. It feels smooth from decades of handling. Maintaining the bed was almost as important as maintaining the fire. A cat wanders across the room and leaps lightly onto the quilt at your feet. It circles once, twice, kneads the bedding and settles, with a purr that vibrates through the straw beneath you. Even animals understood which spot in the room held the most heat. The couple laughs softly and explains that the cat is both a companion and a mouser, a necessary guardian of the bedding in winter when field mice tried to claim the warm nest inside the straw tick. You sit back up, and the quilts slide heavily across your lap. The warmth has begun to seep into your bones, and for a brief moment you imagine drifting towards sleep right here. But the night continues, and there is more to learn. The couple shows you the small warming pan they use occasionally, filled with embers and run gently across the sheets before bedtime. It preheats the mattress in a way that feels almost luxurious for the frontier. You can feel a faint radiance where the pan had been used earlier. When you step away from the bed, you look back at the wide straw tick filling nearly half the room. It is not elegant. It is not soft in a modern sense. But it is functional. It is warm. It is enough to survive the kind of night where frost forms inside the window joints. You thank the couple and step outside once more. The door closes behind you with a dull thud. The cold presses in again, sharper than before, as if reminding you of the vast difference between the fragile comfort inside and the indifferent wilderness beyond. You continue along the creek, your breath drifting ahead of you in pale plumes, ready to learn how people fought not just the cold, but the long dark that winter carried with it. You follow the frozen creek until its path bends toward a scattered cluster of outbuildings, the silhouettes rising like humble guardians against the starlit sky. The cold has sharpened again, a crisp sting that pinches your ears and pushes you to quicken your steps. Ahead, a lantern swings on a hook outside a barn door. Its weak light trembles in the wind, hinting at activity inside. You are walking into the world of nightly watches, those long, slow hours when someone had to stay awake to ensure the fire stayed alive, the animals remained safe, and the cabin did not surrender to the cold. You push the barn door open and step into a pocket of warmer, musky air. The smell of hay leather and livestock wraps around you like a thick blanket. A man sits on a stool near the horses, sharpening a small knife with gentle, steady strokes. His eyelids droop with fatigue, and yet he looks alert in that way only experienced frontiersmen can. He nods in greeting and explains what he is doing. He is not maintaining tools. He is staying awake, staying present, waiting for any shift in the night that requires intervention. Night watches were not a romantic adventure. They were a quiet responsibility shared among family members or hired hands. You walk with him toward the livestock pens and can hear the soft shifting of animals bedding down. Because winter cold could ravage a homestead faster than any bandit people had to keep an ear open for trouble. A cow in distress, a horse kicking at its stall, a roof beam popping in a strange way. One historical recollection describes men waking hourly to check the barn, their lanterns bobbing across snow-covered paths like drifting stars. As he leads you outside again, he explains that winter night duty rotates so no one person loses too much sleep. Tonight is his turn. Tomorrow, his brother. After that, one of the teenage sons. You nod, imagining the exhaustion that comes from patching together fragments of rest. But this was not optional. People who cherished perfect sleep patterns simply did not survive here. He walks you to a small lean-to where he checks a stack of firewood. His lantern light reveals logs split earlier in the day, stacked neatly under a sloping roof. He knocks two together to listen for dryness. A clear, hollow sound means the wood will burn well. A dull thump means it will smoke more than heat. This little sound test survives in some rural traditions even today. He prepares a few logs to take back to the cabin later, muttering that the embers were low when he left. As he works, he tells you about the strangeness of night sounds in winter. A frozen tree can split with a crack so loud it echoes across the plains like a gunshot. Coyotes yipping in the distance sometimes sound like laughter or crying depending on how the cold distorts the pitch. Snow shifting off a roof can mimic the thud of footsteps. He has learned to distinguish these without fully waking. Years of experience sharpened his instincts. For the nightly trio of details, he shares one practical fact first. According to many frontier accounts, people routinely checked their animals at least twice each night in winter because livestock was wealth, livelihood, and survival rolled into one. A lost cow in winter was not just a setback, it could be a catastrophe. Then he offers a tidbit that surprises you. He points out a hollowed-out horn hanging by the barn door. It is filled with a mixture of salt and a bit of dried pepper. He uses it to season warm water for the horses on bitter nights. It is not enough to change the taste drastically, but the animals seem more willing to drink it when temperatures drop far below freezing. This little trick is something he learned from an older cowboy passing through years ago, and he smiles at the memory. As you lean against a fence post, he also mentions that not every historian agrees on how common formal night watches were. Some claim that only ranches with large herds kept a steady rotation. Others argue that even small families practiced it out of necessity, especially in areas with predators or harsh storms. You can see the ambiguity. Life varied too much for a single tidy explanation. You walk with him back toward the barn. The air feels heavier now, a sign that snow might be coming. He notices it too and steps inside to check the horses one more time. Their warm breath steams the air. One stomps a hoof, the sound echoing off the wooden walls. He pats its neck with practiced reassurance. Your guide offers you a seat beside him on a hay bale. He explains how night watch duty changes the way people sleep. They nap lightly, waking at the slightest sound. They never drift into deep dreams until morning. When storms roll in, sleep shrinks into scattered moments snatched between tasks. He jokes that frontier people were early adopters of polyphasic sleep, even if they did not have a fancy name for it. He tells you that the quiet of night brings a different kind of awareness. Sitting alone with only the lantern glow and the soft animal sounds teaches patience, teaches attentiveness. He says sometimes he sits here for hours listening to nothing but his own heartbeat and the quiet creaking of timber. Winter turns sound into a message, a warning, a comfort, a companion. You listen with him for a moment. The barn feels warm compared to outside and the animals shift gently in their stalls. The lantern flickers, casting big, soft shadows on the rafters. A horse exhales with a long, low sigh. Somewhere distant snow slides off a branch with a soft rush. The man yawns and stretches ready to begin another round of checks. He tells you that some nights feel endless, each hour stretching like taffy. Other nights pass quickly, especially when storms demand constant attention. He shrugs and says that winter controls the clock, not people. When he walks you to the barn door again, you feel a wave of cold crash against your skin. He tightens his coat and nods goodbye before stepping back into his realm of flickering lantern light and steady duty. Behind him, the barn door closes softly, muting the warmth of the interior. You stand for a moment under the wide, silent sky, feeling the weight of that responsibility. Someone always had to stay awake. Someone always had to listen. That was the quiet truth of frontier life. You tighten your coat and move on, guided by the distant glow of another homestead waiting somewhere deeper in the night. You leave the barn behind and follow a narrow trail where the snow seems quieter, almost shy beneath your steps. Ahead, the landscape changes subtly. The ground begins to rise and fall in softer contours, and patches of exposed earth peek out under the drifts. You soon reach a dwelling half sunken into the hillside, its roof blending so perfectly with the frozen slope that you almost miss it at first glance. This is a sod house, the kind built low and earthy, borrowing its strength from the land itself. Tonight you will slip inside one and feel what winter warmth meant when walls were made not of timber but of soil. You crouch as you approach the entrance. The doorway is short, reinforced with timber that has seen better days, but the smell of packed earth, rising from within, draws you forward. When you step inside, you immediately sense the difference. The air is not exactly warm, yet it is steadier, less prone to the sharp chill you felt in the cabins above ground. It feels similar to stepping into a cave where the temperature hovers in a narrow range laid down by nature rather than weather. A family is gathered around a low table lit by a single lantern. They greet you with soft nods as if mindful that sound behaves differently down here. Your breath mingles with the cool, earthy scent of the walls, and you run your hand over one. The packed sod feels firm, dense, and surprisingly comforting to the touch. Many written recollections from the frontier note that sod homes stayed more consistent in temperature during winter than log cabins, a detail that you can confirm the moment you remove your gloves. The chill is present, but it is gentler, less biting. The mother of the household invites you to sit on a stool near the hearth, which is small but glowing steadily. She tells you that the ground itself does half the work. The insulation comes naturally from the thick layers of soil and grass roots pressed into the walls. You can see the cross-section at certain exposed corners. Dark earth lighter sand, knotted roots and stray pebbles, all compacted in a way that seems both accidental and ingenious. This place is not beautiful in a decorative way, but in function it excels. While the mother explains the advantages of these homes, the father gets up and taps the ceiling with a short stick. Clumps of dried grass dust drift down like delicate confetti. He chuckles softly and apologizes. That he says is something you just live with. Loose bits of the roof occasionally fall indoors, especially during storms. Not dangerous, but mildly annoying. A little odd tradition has developed around this. Some families keep a strip of linen draped above their beds, so that the debris collects there instead of in their blankets. The mother shows you their own strip of cloth tied neatly at each corner, like a hammock meant to catch dirt rather than dreams. You watch the fire flicker in the small hearth. Its heat spreads outwards slowly rather than climbing. The children sit cross-legged on the floor toes close to the fire wrapped in worn wool. You notice how their boots are lined up neatly against one wall. The soles are dry. In a log cabin, boots often stayed damp for days during winter, but here the earth seems to pull moisture from the air. The father mentions that the house rarely grows humid because the sod walls soak up dampness like a giant sponge. At one point he opens a tiny window flap carved into the soil. You see snow pressed right against the opening. He shuts it quickly to keep the warmth inside. This small detail reminds you that ventilation was always a delicate dance underground. Too much airflow and the house grows cold. Too little, and the smoke becomes stubborn. You look upward and see that the family has fitted a tin pipe through the ceiling to guide smoke out. They have sealed its edges with mud that dried into a cracked halo around the pipe. When you ask whether all settlers embrace sod houses in winter, the father gives a thoughtful shrug. Some researchers claim sod dwellings were universally preferred on treeless plains, but other scholars point out that many families rejected them because of the constant dirt shedding and the presence of insects in warm seasons. Both perspectives capture a piece of the truth. You can imagine someone loving this quiet warmth, and someone else hating the gritty taste of dust that sometimes flavoured their evening meals. A cat slips past your legs and leaps onto a bench. The mother laughs and explains that cats were almost essential in these homes. With earthen walls, little critters always found ways to sneak in, especially during thaw cycles. Her cat keeps the unwelcome visitors in check. While she speaks, you hear the soft, rhythmic scraping of the cat grooming itself. Even this sound feels muted and cozy underground. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the dimness. Light behaves differently here. It is softer, its brightness absorbed by the earth. You feel oddly tucked in by the surroundings. The walls seem to cradle the family as much as they protect them. The temperature has held steady since you entered. No gusts, no drafts, just a gentle coolness that lets the hearth do its work without fighting the winter. The children show you their sleeping area. It is raised slightly off the ground with wooden planks resting on stones. On top lies a thick straw mattress similar to the one you saw earlier, but better insulated from the cold floor. The quilts arranged over it are heavy and patterned with faded blocks of colour. They smell faintly of smoke and earth, a scent that seems inseparable from winter life here. A small detail catches your attention. Near the side of the bed, the family has built a little trough filled with smooth stones, warmed earlier in the hearth. Covered lightly with fabric, these stones radiate a gentle heat that works its way upward through the bedding. The children place these stones near their feet when they sleep. It is a simple luxury, but one that makes a significant difference. The father then calls your attention to something tucked in a corner, a long wooden pole leaning against the wall. He explains that on nights when snowfall is heavy, he uses the pole to poke upward through the ceiling from the inside. This prevents too much drift from building up on the roof and helps ensure that the sod house does not sag under the weight. It is a habit passed through generations somewhere between common sense and folk tradition. As you sit back down, the family begins their quiet nightly routine. The children roll out wool socks near the fire, letting the heat soak in before they put them on. The mother folds a quilt over the bench where she plans to sleep. The father checks the small vent again, making sure it is not clogged with frost. You realise how different the rhythm feels here compared to the log cabins. There is no rattling wind punching through gaps, no sudden chills sweeping across the floor. Instead, the quiet presses in softly, the earth wrapping around the living space like an embrace. You would almost call it peaceful, if not for the awareness of all the maintenance these homes require. When you stand to leave, the family walks you to the doorway. The father brushes a layer of frost off the inside of the frame. The outside world looks brighter from down here, the snow reflecting lantern light in a wide halo. He bids you a gentle good night before retreating back into the warmth that the earth provides so generously. As you climb up into the open night, the air slices across your face again. You glance back at the sod house, its roof blending seamlessly with the hillside. It looks like part of the land, a winter womb holding a family safe in its quiet embrace. You turn and continue into the night, your breath drifting upward like pale smoke. You leave the hillside and move farther into the open country where the land spreads outward in a broad white sheet. The wind carries a faint scent of hay, and soon you spot a large barn with a loft window glowing softly like an eye in the darkness. Snow drifts gather against the outer walls, and the temperature dips so sharply that your breath curls inward before peeling away again. You pull your collar tight as you approach. Tonight you are heading into a place many frontier workers ended up spending their coldest nights. The barn loft where heat rose from animals below, and sleep was a negotiation between comfort and chaos. You climb the ladder slowly, your boots thudding against the rung, sending tiny tremors through the structure. The wooden boards creak beneath you as you reach the loft. The air here surprises you. It is warm compared to outside, edged with the deep, musky aroma of cattle horses and stored hay. It is not the refined warmth of a cabin hearth. It is a dense, living heat that rises from the animals clustered in the stalls below. That warmth has saved many ranch hands from nights that could have frozen their lungs if they tried sleeping in open bunkhouses or tents. 2 cowboys are already settling in for the night. Their bedrolls lie stretched across heaps of hay that look like improvised nests. One of them waves you over, brushing aside hay with his boot to clear you a place to sit. You lower yourself into the soft pile and feel the prick of dry stems poking through your coat. The loft is dim. A single lantern hangs from a peg, painting the rafters with trembling shadows. You take in the environment with slow breaths. Beneath you, a horse exhales with a warm grunt, sending a puff of sweet, steamy breath into the air. The heat from the animals creates a kind of rising tide that pools in the loft. One ranch journal from the late 19th century noted that barns could stay 20 degrees warmer inside than outside on the coldest nights. As you sit here, you can believe it. One cowboy unrolls his bedding, which consists of a canvas outer layer wrapped around wool blankets. This type of bedroll was the standard for travelling ranch hands, durable and quick to set up. He pats the hay underneath it, telling you that the trick is to make the layer thick enough to keep the ground chill from creeping upward. Hay works well enough, though it itches something fierce. He grins knowingly as you shift, trying to find a comfortable spot. While they prepare for sleep, one of the men shares a peculiar habit he picked up from an old trail partner. Every night he sprinkles a small handful of coarse salt along the edges of his bedroll. He says it helps keep mice from scampering over him in search of crumbs. Whether it works or not is unclear, but he says it makes him feel better, and that is enough. You smile at the idea of drawing a salted defensive perimeter in the loft. As the men settle, you ask whether ranch hands always slept in haylofts during winter. One cowboy scratches his chin thoughtfully and says that it varied. Some historians argue that bunkhouses were the default sleeping spaces on established ranches even in winter. Others insist that during storms or long drives men may do wherever the heat was strongest, often in barns exactly like this. The cowboy gestures around him as if presenting evidence for both sides. You can sense how the reality was likely a blend of situations shifting according to weather workload and access to shelter. A cow lows softly below, followed by the rhythmic chewing of hay. These sounds become part of the nighttime tapestry here, soothing in their own earthy way. You lie back on the mound of hay and feel the loft shift under your weight. The ceiling beams arch above you, and you notice tiny gaps where cold air whispers through. Even so, the warmth collecting in this upper pocket of the barn makes the difference between freezing and resting. One cowboy pulls a wool blanket over himself and explains something interesting about the loft's warmth. He points upward. Heat rises, of course, but he notes that the loft traps it because the roof slopes low and the hay acts like insulation. Ranch hands often said you could sleep more comfortably above the animals than beside a weak cabin stove that lost its heat with every draught. It is a practical observation rather than a formal rule, but one that shaped countless winter nights in the West. You run your fingers through the hay beneath you. It feels dry and crisp, carrying the faint grassy scent of late summer. There is something strangely soothing about it, despite the occasional poke to your sleeve. It rustles softly under your hand, a sound that merges with the snorts and shifting hooves below. The men begin to talk quietly, their voices low so they do not startle the animals. They tell stories of winter cattle drives where snowstorms rolled in without warning and forced entire crews to sleep beside their horses, huddled under blankets soaked with melted snow. Compared to those nights, this loft feels like luxury. One of them recalls waking up once with frost on his eyelashes, his moustache solid with ice, because he slept too close to a drafty barn wall. You imagine that shock, that sting of frozen whiskers, and you pull your coat closer. You adjust your position and feel a surprising wave of warmth rising from below. Horses shuffle, cattle grunt, and the air vibrates faintly with their presence. This shared warmth feels ancient, a borrowing of vitality from creatures that shaped daily life here. You close your eyes briefly, letting the sounds lull you. The rhythm of animal breathing becomes a strange form of lullaby. The cowboys tuck themselves deeper into their bedrolls. One mutters that in a few hours he'll wake automatically for a brief check on the herd outside. That is another unspoken rule of ranch life. Even when sleeping in the loft, someone always wakes in the middle of the night to make sure no cattle have broken a fence or wandered toward a snowbank. Sleep arrives in pieces rather than in long, unbroken stretches. The lantern sputters slightly, throwing a flicker across the rafters. One cowboy reaches up and adjusts the wick, restoring its steady glow before settling back into his bedding. The loft grows quieter. Even the animals seem to sense the shift into night rhythm. Their movements slow. Their sounds soften, their heat rises steadily. You sit up slowly, brushing hay from your coat. You glance out the loft window. The world outside is harsh and silent snow sweeping across the land in thin ribbons. Inside, the air carries warmth and breath and life. It feels almost unreal that the same wind clawing at the outer walls cannot touch you here. When you climb down the ladder, the warmth follows you for a moment before dissolving in the cold. You hear a horse snort behind you as if offering a farewell. The barn door closes softly at your back. You walk away from the building, your steps crunching against ice. The night stretches on, and the next winter lesson awaits somewhere beyond the curve of the land. You leave the barn behind and walk toward the wide-open plains where the moonlight floats across the snow in soft silver ribbons. The cold feels heavier here, almost ancient, as though it has been waiting centuries for you to step into its reach. Ahead, you spot a cluster of hide tents and the shadowed forms of people moving quietly around them. Tonight you enter a world shaped by deep indigenous knowledge and frontier adaptation, a place where buffalo robes, hide shelters, and winter craft work guided countless travellers through nights that could steal warmth in minutes. As you approach the first tent, the fire ring outside glows, with a bed of coals that shine like sleeping embers. The warmth pulses gently through the air. A man gestures for you to come closer, and you feel the night soften when you step into the fire's embrace. He sits cross-legged, wrapping a buffalo robe around his shoulders, and the thick hide drapes over him like a natural mantle. When he passes it to you, you feel the astonishing weight. It settles onto your arms like a heavy animal, dense with insulation soft beneath the coarse outer layer. The robe is warmer than any quilt you have touched so far. The woolly underfur traps heat efficiently, and the hide blocks wind with a stubborn resilience. Travellers across the plains prize these robes for winter sleeping because they worked even when damp and resisted cutting winds that slice through ordinary blankets. One account written by a trader described buffalo robes as winter armour, and now you see exactly why. A woman invites you into the hide tent behind the fire ring. When you duck inside, the air surprises you. It is significantly warmer than outside, even though the only heat source is a small central fire pit smouldering quietly. The hide walls glow softly in the firelight, and the structure breathes with a steady warmth that seems almost impossible in this cold. She explains that the shape of the lodge and the layered hides act together to keep the heat contained, and the angled design encourages smoke to drift upward through a small opening rather than collecting inside. You notice sleeping areas arranged in a semicircle along the tent walls. Each spot is layered with robes, furs, and thick woven blankets. The ground beneath is insulated with dried grass or evergreen boughs. When you crouch and touch the layers, they feel soft, springy, and far warmer than the bare earth you expected. One documented observation from a 19th century traveller described how hide lodges, when properly insulated, could maintain surprisingly comfortable temperatures even during intense winter storms. The tent you stand in seems to confirm that idea perfectly. As you take in the cosy interior, one of the elders shares a small unusual detail. He shows you a tiny pouch tied near the sleeping area, filled with a mix of dried sweetgrass and fine ash. He scatters a pinch of it over the bedding each evening. He says it freshens the air, deters insects, and carries a scent that comforts the children. You breathe lightly near it and catch the faintest sweetness lingering in the air. It is a quiet ritual, but one that speaks to generations of lived experience. When you ask about the use of buffalo hide shelters among settlers, the elder tilts his head with a knowing expression. He explains that while some newcomers learned from indigenous communities, others tried to adapt the designs without fully understanding them. Scholars today still express differing views about how widely such techniques spread among frontier settlers. Some suggest hide tents were a rare borrowed solution, while others believe they became more common than written records indicate. As you run your hand along the warm hide wall, it is easy to imagine many travellers embracing anything that offered survival. A young man begins arranging the bedding for the night. He spreads a thick robe along the ground, then layers 2 lighter furs on top. He invites you to sit, and when you do, the warmth rises almost immediately. The hides seem to gather every bit of body heat and reflect it back. You lie down for a moment and feel the fire's glow permeate the space. The The crackle of embers, the soft hum of wind outside, and the rustling of furs create a soothing harmony. The woman brings you a hooded winter cloak made from deer hide lined with rabbit fur. She explains that such garments were often used as sleeping coverings as well as clothing. The fur lining rests lightly against your neck, soft and warm, in a way that feels almost luxurious. She drapes it over you and laughs gently when you sigh with relief. You watch as the family prepares for bed. Their motions are slow, rhythmic, practiced. They check the fire, arrange the bedding, fold extra robes near the entrance to block drafts. The children settle near the warmest part of the tent, close enough to feel the fire's last breath, but far enough to avoid stray sparks. One curls against a robe and falls asleep almost instantly, the soft fur rising and falling with his quiet breaths. The tent walls move slightly with the wind, but inside the warmth remains steady. The smell of smoke mixes with the earthy scent of hides and evergreen boughs. You listen to the gentle breathing rising from each sleeping space. Even your own shoulders begin to relax. A few minutes later, one of the men shows you how they secure the tent flap for the night. He uses a long wooden peg wrapped with hide thongs. The flap closes tightly, sealing the space and preserving the warmth. You understand then that every part of this dwelling, every technique comes from centuries of adaptation to winter's challenges. You stay a while longer, letting the heat sink into your bones, listening to the soft crackle of coals turning to ash. When you finally rise to leave, the family offers you a spare robe to carry with you until you reach your next stop. You drape it over your shoulders, feeling instantly cocooned. You step outside and the cold rushes toward you, but cannot quite break through the robe's warmth. Behind you, the hide tent glows softly, its interior, a pocket of life carved from the frozen plains. You walk forward again, footprints trailing behind you like small stories pressed into the snow. You follow a narrow trail where the snow crunches softly underfoot each step, sending up tiny crystals that glimmer in the moonlight. The air feels sharper here, as if winter has taken a deeper breath. Ahead, you spot a small cabin tucked between two cottonwoods, its chimney exhaling a whisper of smoke that coils into the dark sky. You already sense that tonight you will learn about one of the clever little tricks frontier families relied on when the cold pressed in from every direction, heating stones or bricks until they glowed faintly, then slipping them beneath blankets to carry warmth into the long hours of darkness. The cabin door opens before you reach it. A young woman waves you inside, her cheeks rosy from tending the hearth. The room is snug, the low ceiling trapping warmth like a cupped hand. A smell of boiling broth mingles with the scent of pine logs burning in the stove. You step closer and feel heat radiating from the iron belly of the stove in slow, steady waves. On a small table, several smooth stones sit wrapped in cloth squares. She unties one and reveals a stone still holding the faintest pinkish glow at its core. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to feel like a captured piece of summer. She places it into a quilt pocket sewn specifically for this purpose. You run your fingers along the quilt and notice how evenly the warmth spreads. According to many household recollections from the era, people heated stones, bricks, or even metal irons in their stoves each evening, allowing them to act as personal heaters long after the fire dimmed. The practice shows up in letters, journals, and memories passed down through families. As you examine the warmed stone, she explains an interesting little custom. Her grandmother swore that if you placed a sprig of cedar under the cloth wrapping, the warm air carried a soothing scent that helped children sleep through storms. Whether the scent truly had calming qualities or simply triggered a sense of comfort remains unknown, but the idea charms you. You lift the cloth and smell a faint woodsy sweetness rising from the wrapped stone. The woman gestures toward the bed tucked along the far wall. It is piled with quilts folded in careful layers, each one thicker than the last. She tucks a couple of the warm stones between the lower blankets, spreading the heat so it does not concentrate in one spot. You watch her press the layers gently, almost like sealing warmth into a storage chest. She smiles faintly when she sees your curiosity. This is simply part of her nightly rhythm. You ask whether all households followed the same stone-warming techniques. The woman shrugs lightly. Some researchers give slightly different accounts depending on region, noting that families in areas with abundant hardwood tended to heat bricks or iron tools more often, while those farther west relied on stones from riverbeds because they retained heat well without cracking. Other scholars believe such distinctions are overstated, arguing that families used whatever was convenient. You see how both viewpoints could fit because the frontier rewarded practicality far more than strict tradition. Her husband enters the room carrying another armful of firewood. Snow dusts his shoulders and melts into droplets as he approaches the stove. He sets the wood down and begins to rearrange the embers with a poker, creating a small nest for another round of stones to warm. A soft hiss rises from the embers as he positions them carefully. You watch the stones transform from dull grey to a gentle warmth that seems to breathe through their surfaces. He mentions a small detail that does not always appear in written accounts. Some stones, if taken from near a riverbank, hold traces of moisture deep inside. If heated too quickly, they can crack loudly or even pop apart. His father taught him to dry stones near the stove for several days before heating them fully. A simple precaution, but one that saved many startled nights. The children, meanwhile, have begun arranging their own small foot warmers at the end of the bed. These are metal tins filled with heated sand. One child lifts a tin and shakes it slightly so the sand settles more evenly. You can hear the soft sift of grains inside. This technique shows up occasionally in pioneer writings, though not as commonly as heated stones. The boy explains proudly that the sand holds heat longer than you would expect, especially when wrapped in wool. You take a seat at the edge of the bed, feeling the warmth slowly spreading beneath the quilts. The sensation is subtle at first, like a gentle pulse rising from the mattress. Then it grows steady and reassuring. You exhale, surprised at how quickly it sinks into your muscles. The warmth has a patience to it, a kind of quiet persistence that fights the cold inch by inch. The woman settles beside you to demonstrate how they keep the heat from escaping during the coldest nights. She folds an extra quilt along the bed's edge, creating a barrier that traps warmth around the feet and legs. She jokes that it looks like barricading against imaginary cold spirits, but it works. The small curl of humour softens the cabin's seriousness. As the family prepares for bed, the room begins to settle into a nighttime rhythm. The fire crackles less frequently. The stones in the stove shift softly as their temperatures change. The lantern on the table dims slowly to save oil. You hear the children whispering about the shapes they see in the firelight. The parents exchange tired smiles. Everything feels gently anchored to the warmth they have created. You lie back briefly, allowing the heated stones to cradle your spine through the quilts. You can almost imagine yourself drifting into a half sleep, lulled by the rhythm of the stove and the softness of the bedding. Outside, a gust of wind skims along the eaves, but the warmth beneath the quilts barely stirs. A short while later, the husband checks the stove one last time before resting. He adjusts a vent, ensuring the embers will last until dawn. The woman tucks the stones more firmly into the bedding. Her movements are slow and deliberate, shaped by winters, long enough to teach that comfort must be layered thoughtfully. When you finally rise to leave, the warmth clings to your clothes for a fleeting moment. You step outside into the brittle cold and the contrast feels immediate and sharp. Your breath curls away in tiny clouds. Behind you, the cabin glows softly, its warmth preserved like a treasure. You continue along the frozen trail, carrying with you a pocket of fading heat, and the quiet reminder that survival sometimes depends on the simplest tools made extraordinary by the hands that use them. You continue along the trail until the land grows still enough that even your breath feels too loud. The sky stretches wide and silent, swollen with cold. After a few minutes, you arrive at a solitary cabin perched on a ridge. No smoke rises from the chimney yet. A faint lantern glow peeks through the frost-coated window, hinting that someone inside is awake. Tonight you are stepping into the uneasy soundtrack of frontier winter nights, when every sound mattered and silence itself could wake you. You push open the door and find a man seated near a dimming fire. He lifts his head at your arrival, offering a tired but friendly nod. A pot hangs above smouldering embers, its contents releasing a faint herbal aroma. You step inside, letting your eyes adjust to the low light. The floorboards groan beneath you in a way that feels intentional, as if the cabin wants you to understand its presence. You take a seat beside the man. Outside, the wind brushes against the walls with a soft, ghostly murmur. He lifts a finger and tells you to listen. At first, you hear nothing unusual. Then faintly, the beams above you creak like old bones shifting in their sleep. He explains that on nights like this, the temperature drops fast enough to make wood contract sharply. Travellers from the era sometimes wrote that the loud snapping of timbers startled them awake, especially on the coldest nights when the cabin protested every frozen shift. The man pours you a cup of warm broth and continues. He says that some homesteaders boasted they could identify approaching storms by the way their cabin sounded. He leans back, closes his eyes, and imitates the deep rumble of wind pressing against a weak corner. His voice blends eerily with the real wind outside. He's joking a bit, but there is truth under it. People slept lightly because a house spoke its warnings through creaks and groans. As you sip the broth, you catch a new noise from outside. A distant howl rises briefly, not quite coyote, not quite wolf. It echoes across the snow, thin and lonely. The man nods. He says that such calls were common in winter, especially when animals roamed closer to settlements searching for food. One observation recorded in a late 19th century letter describes wolves circling cabins during deep snows, not attacking, but howling in patterns that sounded like conversations. You hear another rising wail, higher this time, and a shiver climbs your spine. The man then shares a small, peculiar practice he developed over the years. He keeps a bundle of dried corn husks hanging near the window frame. When wind slips through any tiny gap, the husks rustle in a distinctive way. He claims it helps him tell the difference between harmless drafts and more serious structural issues. You reach up to touch the husks. They feel papery and light, and you imagine how the soft whisper of their movement might alert him before the cold becomes a problem. You ask him whether most settlers paid this much attention to night sounds. He chuckles. Some probably did not, he says, but many grew attuned to their environment out of necessity. Scholars examining frontier diaries sometimes disagree about how much emphasis families placed on nighttime vigilance. Some insist it was essential for survival, while others argue that people gradually grew accustomed to the noises and slept through most of them. Listening to the man's stories, you suspect the truth depends on personality as much as circumstance. Another noise breaks your conversation. A gentle tapping comes from above like fingertips on the roof. The man explains that it is snow sliding down the shingles in small sheets. When temperatures shift slightly, the top layer loosens. You can almost picture it, a thin blanket slipping downward and scattering into the darkness below. The sound would be harmless enough, except that during heavy storms it could indicate dangerous build-up. He says he sometimes wakes 3 or 4 times a night to check whether snow is piling too heavily on one side of the roof. You tilt your head and listen again. This time you hear something softer, barely there. Tiny scratching along the far wall. The man sighs. Mice. Winter drives them indoors, seeking crumbs or warmth near the stove. He keeps traps set and a cat inside, yet still they return. Many settlers wrote that mice offered their own nightly chorus during the cold months, sometimes so persistent that they woke the household again and again. The fire dims enough that the cabin grows noticeably colder. The man tosses in a couple of small logs, each landing with a dull thud. Sparks leap upward, then fade into the chimney's throat. The sudden burst of light reveals dust motes floating lazily in the air, disturbed by the rising heat. He returns to his chair with a heavy sigh and tells you that winter nights sometimes stretched endlessly, because the sounds outside seem to slow time itself. Nothing but windwood and the occasional animal cry to measure the hours. To balance the eerie atmosphere, he shares a curious little memory. As a boy, he used to lie awake listening for what his family jokingly called the snow sprites. These were not real creatures, of course, but the name they gave to the rapid, tiny tapping sounds created when ice crystals formed along window frames. He smiles at the recollection, saying the noise resembles fingertips drumming lightly against glass. You settle deeper into your chair, the warmth from the fire easing into your knees. The cabin continues murmuring around you. Another creak rolls through the rafters deeper than the last. The man glances upward unconcerned. To him the sound is familiar, almost comforting. A reminder that the cabin is still standing and still holding its ground against the winter. You ask him what noise unsettles him most. He does not hesitate. Silence, he says. When the wind stops, when animals go quiet, when even the trees hold their breath, something is coming. Perhaps a storm, perhaps a hard freeze, perhaps a shift in the weather so sharp that the temperature plummets without warning. Silence is never empty in winter. It is a signal. You finish your broth and stand slowly. The man rises with you, walking you to the door. Before you step outside, you pause and listen. The wind hums along the eaves like a long sigh. A branch scrapes against the corner of the cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a lone animal cries out before falling silent again. When you open the door, the cold greets you immediately. The noises of the night seem clearer out here, stripped of the cabin's muffling walls. You turn back and see the man lowering the lantern wick, preparing to sleep, with one ear attuned to every creak and whisper. You step into the snow, leaving the warm shelter behind the night's chorus swelling around you as you continue your journey. You walk deeper into the night, guided by faint orange glimmers rising from a cluster of small cabins tucked between bare cottonwoods. As you approach the nearest one, the air sharpens with a smoky tang that clings to your throat. You cough lightly, surprised by how thick the scent is. Tonight you're stepping into a problem that almost every frontier family wrestled with during winter's smoky interiors, where warmth and danger sat far too close together. You knock once and push the door open. A swirling cloud greets you, tinted gold by lamplight. The woman inside waves you forward with a wool mitten, her eyes squinting through the haze. You step in and feel the warmth instantly, but the smoke nips at your lungs in a way that feels unsettling. A stove stands proudly in the centre of the room, but the stovepipe trembles with each gust of wind outside, causing little puffs of smoke to escape into the cabin before they can rise through the pipe. You take a seat at the edge of a wooden bench while the woman adjusts the damper, grumbling under her breath. She explains that this particular stove has a habit of belching smoke whenever the wind shifts. Several noted letters from the era describe this very frustration, especially with early iron stoves that lacked modern airflow control. Smoke curled into the rafters, filled the corners, and clung to clothing until everything smelled like scorched pine. She moves the kettle aside and shows you the stovepipe connection. You see where it meets the wall, sealed with a ring of clay and ash that has begun to crack. The tiniest opening is enough to let smoke seep indoors. She pokes at the seal with a small stick, causing a soft flake of clay to crumble. A sigh escapes her. Repairs will have to wait until morning. Her husband enters from the adjoining room, wiping soot off his hands. He laughs quietly about how they once tried stuffing damp moss around the pipe to improve the seal. It dried out in a day and fell apart like old bread. A few families experimented with rawhide strips soaked and hardened into shape, but these too required constant maintenance. You can almost see the trial and error in every corner of this cabin. While you observe the smoky room, the husband shares an odd little habit he developed over years of winter struggle. He hangs a tiny brass bell near the stovepipe. If smoke begins to build too rapidly, the bell's edges vibrate as the hot air changes direction. He claims the sound woke him more reliably than anything else, even the children's crying. You lift the bell and hear a faint metallic whisper, imagining it jingling lightly in the hours before dawn. When you ask whether families everywhere suffered the same issues, the couple exchanges thoughtful glances. Some modern researchers argue that poorly designed chimneys were widespread on the frontier, especially in fast-built cabins. Others suggest that many households learned efficient techniques from indigenous neighbours, or immigrant traditions, meaning smoke-filled interiors were less common than popular stories suggest. The couple shrugs, acknowledging the blurry line between well-documented problems and exaggerated tales. The woman invites you to sit close to the stove. As you move, the smoke shifts, rising in a slow column, before dispersing beneath the beams overhead. You tilt your head and notice the rafters stained dark as if years of winter soot have painted them into permanence. She chuckles softly when she sees your gaze. She says that families often tied herbs or strips of cloth above the stove, not as decoration, but to disguise the persistent scent. Sage mint, or a twist of dried apple peel, might lend the air a gentler character. A child steps into the room clutching a small bundle. He unrolls it to reveal a flat stone still warm from sitting by the fire earlier. He slips it under a pile of blankets arranged near the stove. The mother nods approvingly. This is their warm sleep corner, the spot they use when smoke grows too dense to sleep comfortably near the chimney vent. You crouch and touch the bedding. The warmth lingers even with the air around it swirling with haze. You ask how they balance warmth and ventilation. This question makes both parents laugh in weary amusement. It is an ongoing negotiation, they say. Some nights they crack the door open just an inch so the air can circulate. Other nights they wedge a stick under the window frame, creating a tiny gap that draws smoke outward. But doing so, of course, lets the cold sneak inside. You can almost feel the tension between breathability and heat pressing at the edges of the room. The husband stokes the fire with a practiced motion. Sparks dance upward and vanish. The stove groans softly as new heat builds. You hear a faint rattle from the stovepipe followed by a wheezy cough from the chimney. A thin ribbon of smoke swirls toward the ceiling. The woman grabs a long wooden spoon and nudges the damper again. Her movements are sharp and certain, shaped by countless winter nights spent taming this iron beast. She tells you a memory from her childhood. Her mother used to place a silver coin on the stove surface. When the room filled too heavily with smoke, the coin tarnished more quickly. It was a loose test, not scientific in any way, yet families used anything that hinted at early warning. You imagine children watching the coin darken and calling out in alarm. You stand and move toward the window. Frost feathers bloom across the glass in intricate patterns. When you touch the pane, the cold stabs your skin before fading into numbness. Outside, the wind moans along the eaves, urging more smoke into the room. Inside, the air remains thick but manageable. You can see how winter nights demanded constant adaptation, each family inventing small solutions to hold discomfort at bay. The woman begins settling the children into their sleeping corner away from the drafty area near the chimney. She layers quilts over them, whispering soft instructions about staying warm. The husband checks the stovepipe once more before seating himself beside you. The room gradually steadies. The fire hums low. The smoke thins just enough to reveal the shape of the cabin clearly again. For a moment, the atmosphere feels almost peaceful. A fragile peace, but peace nevertheless. When you step outside, the fresh air shocks your lungs. You cough once, tasting the smoky residue still clinging to your throat. Behind you, the cabin window glows softly. A shadow moves inside, adjusting the stove again, fighting the same battle that will continue until spring. You wrap your coat tighter and press forward into the night, the cold once again claiming the space around you. You leave the smoky cabin behind and follow a winding path that dips toward a frozen ravine. The snow grows deeper here, swallowing your boots with each step. A bitter wind sweeps along the hollow, carrying the faint rattle of something metal. When you crest the next rise, you spotted a freight wagon tilted slightly on uneven ground, the canvas top coated in a thin sheet of ice. The lantern flickering beneath the wagon looks fragile against the immense cold. Tonight, you're stepping into the world of stranded travellers, people caught between destinations who are forced to improvise shelter. Beneath wagons, burlap sacks, or whatever scraps they had on hand, you draw closer and hear low voices murmuring under the wagon. 2 men and a woman sit on bundled blankets, their faces lit by a tiny fire shielded by a semicircle of stones. The fire is no bigger than a dinner plate, but its warmth reaches you the moment you crouch beside them. The woman gestures for you to squeeze in. You duck your head and settle onto a patch of stiff grass, half thawed by the fire's glow. The first thing you notice is the draft. Cold gusts slip under the wagon and over your shoulders, cutting through your coat until you instinctively hunch down. The travellers laugh softly, amused by your reaction. They explain that this is one of the unavoidable realities of sleeping on the trail. Even sturdy freight wagons could not block the wind entirely. Many journals written by merchants and emigrants mention nights spent huddled beneath their wagons when storms made progress impossible. The canvas tops trapped some heat, but the space beneath still breathed winter's sharpness. The woman unwraps a bundle beside her and pulls out a wool cloak patched so many times it resembles a quilt of mismatched shapes. She spreads it across her knees, inviting you to feel its weight. The fabric is coarse but dense enough to hold warmth. She points to a square stitched near the centre. It is made from an old flour sack stamped with faded letters. She chuckles and tells you that every scrap counts on nights like this. The man closest to the tiny fire lifts a metal cup filled with warm water sweetened lightly with molasses. He explains that they heat the cup periodically and hold it near their faces, letting the steam thaw their noses. It is a small comfort, but comforting nonetheless. He says that trail travellers sometimes slept with heated stones wrapped in grain sacks, tying them near their feet inside blankets. He taps the burlap sack behind him where you see a faint shape suggesting a warm rock within. As you sit with them, the second man starts recounting the oddest trick he ever saw during a bad winter crossing. A fellow traveller carried a thin sheet of tin and wedged it against the underside of the wagon, creating a reflective barrier that bounced heat downward. It supposedly warmed the space noticeably. He shrugs, admitting he never tried it himself, but the story stuck with him. You imagine that thin tin shimmering faintly in firelight, offering a sliver of extra warmth. Curious you ask whether wagon shelters were commonly used by those caught mid-journey. The travellers exchange thoughtful glances. One notes that some surviving trail accounts paint it as a widespread practice, while other documents suggest it was more of an emergency tactic used only during storms. The truth seems layered, shaped by weather terrain, and how desperate the travellers were. Listening to these perspectives, you feel how easily the past becomes a tapestry of uneven memories. A sudden scraping sound outside startles you. The wagon rocks slightly. The woman leans forward, lifting the canvas flap. Snow slumps off the roof in a slanted sheet, scattering into powder as it hits the ground. The makeshift fire flickers but survives. You hear the faint crackle of ice breaking as the wagon shifts on frozen earth. Now the travellers begin arranging their sleeping area. The ground beneath the wagon is layered with pine boughs gathered earlier. When you run your fingers across them, the needles feel stiff and sharp, but their scent adds a refreshing note that cuts through the cold air. The boughs act as insulation, lifting the blankets away from the icy soil. Many pioneers use this method when camping in winter, placing fresh greenery under their bedding whenever possible. It was a small but important buffer between body heat and frozen ground. The woman unfurls a long blanket woven from wool dyed a deep brown. It is thin compared to the heavy quilts you have seen in cabins, but she folds it in thirds to make it thicker. She shows you how they tuck the ends beneath themselves to trap every scrap of warmth. She hands you a length of rope and invites you to watch as they lash a corner of the canvas tighter. This prevents loose snow from blowing in during the night. The rope is rough, biting into your gloves as you help hold it. They then bank the fire with small stones so it gives slow, steady heat. The cup of warm water is refilled and passed around. The woman hums quietly a soft melody that rises and falls like distant wind. You feel your shoulders loosen despite the chilly drafts. There is something calming about the rhythm of their routine, a practiced dance learned through hardship. The second man pulls out a leather pouch and sprinkles something across the pine boughs. When you ask, he explains that it is dried sage crushed into powder. He says it helps mask the smell of damp blankets and makes the space feel cleaner somehow. The aroma rises, gently mixing with smoke and cold in a subtle, soothing swirl. As you settle deeper into the small circle, the wind grows stronger outside. Snow skitters across the wagon wheels in soft bursts. The fire flickers again, casting tall shadows along the canvas roof. The travellers pull their cloaks tighter and speak in hushed tones about their plan for dawn. If the storm passes and the trail firms up, they hope to continue westward. If not, they will wait, gather more wood, and try to stay warm another night. You ask them whether fear is part of nights like this. They shrug. Fear, they say, only wastes warmth. They keep focused, keep moving, keep adjusting. You admire their calm in the face of winter's vastness. As the hour grows late, the trio begins settling under their blankets. One tucks a warm stone near his chest. Another pulls her hood low over her eyes. You realise their bodies will share heat instinctively through the night, huddling closer when the fire ebbs. This wagon bay, cramped and uneven, becomes a small sanctuary carved out of necessity. You rise carefully, brushing pine needles from your knees. The space is dim now, only the faint glow of dying embers lighting their bundled forms. You whisper a quiet farewell and slip out into the cold. The night greets you with a sharp bite. The wagon stands behind you like a fragile shelter in a boundless winter, its canvas trembling softly in the wind. You continue onward, the snow swallowing your footsteps as quickly as you make them. You walk away from the freight wagon, tracing a path where the snow gleams in long ripples under the moon. The land opens wide again, empty in a way that makes every breath sound louder. After a while you notice a faint glow far ahead, a small fire tucked against a cluster of rocks. The smoke rises in a thin ribbon, and the closer you get, the more clearly you hear soft voices drifting through the cold. Tonight you're sliding into the world of the cowboy bedroll, a kind of travelling cocoon wrapped around exhaustion, grit, and whatever warmth a long winter night might permit. As you approach, the cowboys nod in welcome without rising from their spots around the fire. Their hats sit low over their brows, the brims dusted with frost. Bedrolls lie scattered in a half circle, each one a long canvas envelope, folded back to reveal layers of wool blankets within. The cowboys gesture for you to join them. You lower yourself onto a flat patch of frozen earth near the fire and feel the cold reach through your trousers like a warning. One of the men flips open his bedroll to show you its interior. The canvas outer shell feels stiff, creased from years of use, while the inner blankets look worn but dense. He folds one corner back so you can touch the wool. It is rougher than the quilts you've felt in cabins more utilitarian than decorative, but thick enough to feel like a shield once wrapped around a tired body. Riders of the era frequently describe their bedrolls as their closest companions on long cattle drives, serving as coat mattress and fortress against the cold. You lean closer and catch the mingled scent of canvas, sagebrush, horse sweat, and wood smoke. It is a smell that clings to the clothes of anyone who has spent weeks out on the trail. The cowboy grins when he sees your reaction, saying that a man smells like his work and there is no point pretending otherwise. While you warm your hands near the fire, another cowboy shows you how he arranges his bedroll on winter nights. First, he spreads it wide so the ground has time to warm slightly from the fire's radiance. Then, he shakes out the blankets, loosening any frost that might have formed if the bedroll was damp earlier. He says that many riders learn to turn their bedrolls inside out each afternoon, to air them out a detail sometimes mentioned in old ranch journals. Letting the fabric breathe prevented moisture from stiffening into icy sheets. The fire crackles beside you, and the cowboys begin preparing for sleep. One of them stuffs his boots beneath the foot of his bedroll so they do not freeze solid overnight. The boots look like pieces of dark leather carved into shape, and you imagine trying to slip your feet into them if they hardened in the cold. He chuckles when you shiver at the thought, saying that a cowboy with frozen boots may as well ride barefoot. As you watch them settle in, a cowboy shares a curious memory. On especially cold nights, he says his old trail boss used to tuck a warmed tin cup into the bedroll, not to drink from, but simply to radiate heat. The man believed the cup held the fire long enough to let him fall asleep. The cowboy shrugs as he tells the story, unsure whether the practice helped, or merely gave the trail boss something to focus on. But the idea lingers in your mind, even tiny comforts mattered. You ask whether sleeping in bedrolls was standard across the West. The cowboys glance at each other before answering. Surviving letters and trail accounts offer slightly different pictures. Some cowhands claim to sleep under the stars year-round, wrapped in canvas unless storms forced them into makeshift shelters. Others described moving between bunkhouses, barns, or porches when work allowed. The cowboys sitting before you shrug, acknowledging the inconsistency. As they put it, you slept where the work ended, not where comfort lived. One cowboy motions you closer and shows you how to lie inside a bedroll properly. He spreads the canvas envelope open then demonstrates how to fold the side flaps over your shoulders and feet so the wind cannot reach you. You climb inside, tentatively sinking into the wool layers. The warmth is immediate, especially near the fire. The canvas feels heavy, almost protective, and the faint smell of horses clings to the fabric. You draw the flaps tighter and let your body settle into the earthy scent of dust and grass. The cold seems to pause just outside the layers. It is not gone, but softened. You can imagine a cowboy falling asleep like this after a day spent riding through snow or driving cattle across a river that froze at the edges. The bedroll becomes a small world all its own. A horse snorts in the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound is deep and peaceful. You lift your head and see the silhouettes of the herd standing close together, their breath rising in gentle clouds. One cowboy explains that they sleep lightly, always listening for the horse's movements. If a horse shifts oddly or snorts in alarm, it could mean a predator or a weather change. Many cowboys developed an ear for such signals without fully waking. A moment later, the cowboy closest to the fire picks up a handful of dirt and sprinkles it over the flames. The fire lowers to a steady glow, good for warmth, but less likely to throw sparks. He folds himself into his bedroll and sighs deeply, the sound heavy with fatigue. The firelight paints the canvas in warm gold, and the bedrolls resemble long cocoons lined neatly in the dirt. The cold intensifies once the fire dims, but the bedroll traps enough heat to keep your body comfortable. You listen to the quiet rasp of canvas adjusting to the cowboy's movements. The night sky above is vast, sharp, and filled with stars. One cowboy murmurs that on some nights he swears he can hear the stars crackle with cold. You smile at the poetic exaggeration, yet in this silence, it feels strangely believable. A few of the men doze quickly, their breathing merging with the rhythmic snorts of the horses. Another cowboy whispers a short trail song to himself, barely more than a hum. It vibrates softly through the bedroll fabric, as warm as the fading firelight. Eventually you ease yourself out of the bedroll, feeling the night air bite instantly at your skin. The cowboy who lent you the space lifts his hat slightly in farewell without fully waking. You stand brushing frost from your coat and feel the pull of warmth still lingering in the layers of your clothes. You step back from the camp. The fire is now a low ember patch. The cowboys lie bundled in their long canvas shells, their outlines faint under the moon. The horses shift quietly in the shadows, forming their own huddled constellation. You turn and continue walking, leaving behind a small circle of warmth carved into the cold wilderness, ready to discover what winter offers next on this long frontier night. You move on from the cowboy camp, climbing a gentle rise where the wind feels sharper and carries the distant metallic clang of tools. When you crest the hill, you see the faint glow of lanterns flickering through a small cluster of tents, their canvas stiffened into frozen peaks. The entire mining camp looks brittle under the moonlight, as though one strong gust might shatter it like glass. Tonight you are stepping into the frigid world of gold rush seekers, the ones who faced winter in thin canvas shelters barely suited for spring, let alone the harsh season settling around you now. You approach the nearest tent, its entrance tied loosely to let smoke escape. A miner waves you inside with a tired grin. The warmth hits you first, radiating from a little iron stove that looks ridiculously small for the task. The stove flickers with uneven flames, sending light crawling up the tent walls like restless shadows. Even standing close to the heat, you can feel cold trying to squeeze in from every seam. The miner offers you a seat on an overturned bucket beside a clutter of tools. His hands are cracked and darkened by grit, his breath curling in the dim air like pale ribbons. He tells you that mining camps in winter were never truly warm. Diaries from the era often mention tents freezing stiff overnight, their surfaces turning rigid with frost until they felt like wooden planks. As you look around, you can see exactly what he means. The canvas crackles whenever the wind nudges it, as though it is made of thin frozen bark. He stirs a pot on the stove. The scent of beans and something vaguely meaty fills the interior. When he hands you a tin cup, your fingers absorb the warmth instantly. The simple meal tastes smoky and grounding, a reminder that warm food was as essential as warm blankets out here. He laughs quietly as he watches you eat, saying that meals in winter always felt more important because they kept both hunger and fear at bay. As you sip the stew, another miner ducks into the tent, brushing ice from his beard. He throws a small burlap sack onto a cot and mutters about the cold settling deeper tonight. You glance at the cot he's aiming for. It is little more than a canvas sling stretched across a wooden frame. A few wool blankets lie crumpled in the middle. When you press your hand to them, they feel cold to the core, as if the fibres themselves hold memories of frost. One of the men sits beside you and begins telling a story about a particularly harsh winter 2 years back. He says the miners were forced to chip ice off the inside of their tents using the handles of spoons. He demonstrates with a laugh, tapping the tent wall until frost flakes drift down onto your sleeve. In old letters, miners often described waking with frost on their beards, and blankets so stiff they crackled when folded. You brush the frost from your arm and watch it fall like powdered sugar to the ground. After a moment, another miner produces something unexpected. He unfolds a long strip of wool dyed a deep blue, worn thin in places but still soft. He says his mother mailed it from back east and that he wraps it around his neck while sleeping. One of the men snorts at this, but you can see the fondness in their teasing. The miner hands it to you, and you feel how snug the fabric is despite the cold. He claims that wearing it in winter prevents his breath from freezing uncomfortably on his collar. You hand it back carefully. Curious about how they maintain heat in a place like this, you observe the stove more closely. The draft pipe rattles whenever wind pushes against the tent. The miner explains that some camps constructed stone fire pits, or even dug partial shelters into hillsides, but tents like this were more common among transient workers. Records from mining settlements mention both approaches, yet accounts vary widely about which method was more practical. The men shrug when you ask which is better, insisting it depends entirely on luck, weather, and the sturdiness of the available materials. The stove pops suddenly sending a brief spark against the tent wall. The miner calmly smothers it with his boot as if this is nothing new. He then kneels and adjusts a stone he's placed in front of the stove. The stone is warm to the touch when you reach out. He explains that they heat it in the evenings to tuck under blankets later. A simple method, but one that makes a significant difference once the fire dies down. Earlier travellers mentioned using similar stones, though their accounts often emphasise how quickly the warmth fades in harsh winters like this. A gust hits the tent hard enough to make the entire structure shudder. The lantern swings slightly, casting wild shadows. The men listen closely for a moment, assessing whether the wind will worsen. When the gust passes, they relax again, their shoulders settling back into familiar positions. They have learned to interpret the night's moods by sound alone. The tent flap opens again, and a fourth miner crawls in, dragging a bundle behind him. When he unfolds it, you see a thick animal pelt, perhaps from a coyote or small wolf. He spreads it across the cot and pats the fur. He tells you he traded for it yesterday, and that it will make the cot warmer than wool alone. The other men nod knowingly. Fur, even in small pieces, had a reputation for holding heat better than most fabrics. Its value only grew sharper the farther you were from a warm cabin. He shows you how they layer their bedding, a canvas ground cloth, then a thin wool blanket, then the fur, and finally 2 more blankets folded double at the top. You run your hand across the fur and imagine trying to sleep beneath it, with the wind clawing at the tent walls. You can see how this layering would matter, how it would mimic the weight and warmth of a proper bed even in this temporary shelter. One miner begins sharpening a small pick, the scrape of metal filling the space with a steady rhythm. The sound blends with the wind outside. You look around and notice tiny pockets of frost accumulating where the tent folds touch the ground. It is strange watching ice form inside a living space, as though winter is laying claim to the interior inch by inch. As bedtime draws near, the men settle into their sleeping spots. One wraps the blue wool strip around his neck. Another places the heated stone under his blankets. The third draws the pelt across his chest. They tease each other lightly about snoring and stealing blankets, their voices softening as fatigue settles in. The fire lowers. The stove ticks faintly as metal contracts. Cold begins creeping back into the tent, curling around your ankles. You watch the miners burrow into their bedding, their breaths rising in small white wisps. Despite the thin walls and the biting wind, the tent feels strangely intimate, a little pocket of determined warmth in a landscape made entirely of ice. When you crawl outside, the cold hits you with a clarity that steals the breath from your chest. Your footsteps crunch loudly, echoing through the stillness. Behind you, the mining camp glows faintly. Canvas tents shimmer under the moon as if dressed in frost armor. You turn toward the next rise in the landscape, ready to see what other nighttime challenges winter in the west has left waiting for you. You travel along a narrow path flanked by bare willows until you reach a larger settlement than the ones you have seen so far. Lanterns glow behind frosted windows and a low murmur of voices drifts into the cold air. A wooden sign swings above a doorway, creaking softly. Tonight you step into a frontier inn, one of the few places where winter travellers might find 4 walls of fire and a chance to sleep next to strangers whose names they might never learn. These inns were social crossroads, warm hives of human noise in a season that swallowed sound. You open the door and warmth spills out like a breath from a giant. Inside the room buzzes with overlapping conversations. Boots stomp snow from their soles, wet mittens hang near the fire, and the scent of roasting meat floats through the air. You slip inside and close the door behind you, letting the cold unwind from your shoulders. The innkeeper, a round-faced woman with sleeves rolled to her elbows, waves you toward an empty stool near the fire. The fire crackles loudly, fighting the winter with all the vigour it can muster. You warm your hands and take in the scene. Travellers of every kind crowd the tables, freighters with tired shoulders, ranch hands still dusted in ice crystals, peddlers bundled in mismatched layers, and a pair of teenagers clutching steaming mugs of something sweet. A group of men play cards near the corner, their laughter rising over the clatter of dishes. Inns like this appear frequently in old travel notes, mentioned as rare sanctuaries that offered shelter more than luxury. They were places where you hoped for a warm floorboard rather than a comfortable bed. As you sit near the fire, the innkeeper hands you a bowl of thick stew. You savour its warmth, letting it spread through your chest. The chatter around you forms a steady hum. A bearded traveller next to you leans in and explains that winter inns often doubled as bunkhouses. When beds filled, strangers slept shoulder to shoulder on the floor. He points toward the staircase where a cluster of boots already lines the hallway like awkward sentries. The innkeeper taps your shoulder and leads you upstairs to see the sleeping arrangements. The stair treads groan under your weight, and the narrow hallway above feels packed with sighs and quiet footsteps. At the end of the hall, she pushes open a door. Inside is a room no larger than a modern pantry, yet it contains 4 beds, each one claiming a corner. Quilts are piled high on every mattress, their colours dimmed by lamplight. The warmth in the room feels lived in, almost heavy. She smiles and tells you that the beds fill by order of arrival. If more travellers come, pallets are set on the floor. She gestures toward a woven rug, already laid out, a thin cushion placed at its end. You run your hand along one of the beds and feel the fabric give slightly under your palm. Someone has slept there recently. It still carries the residual heat of a long day's exhaustion. A few travellers arrive behind you and the room quickly fills with the rustle of blankets and the low murmur of introductions. One young woman sets her pack down and says she's heading north in the morning. She laughs quietly and warns you not to sleep too close to the wall because frost creeps along the boards at night. You touch the wooden panelling and feel a faint chill radiating from it. Stories from the period often mention this problem walls that looked solid enough by day but turned into cold magnets once the fire below dimmed. A man with a scar across his cheek spreads his coat on the pallet and begins telling the group a memory from his time on a mail coach route. He says that once in midwinter every bed in an inn was taken, and the travellers had to sleep upright in chairs, taking turns leaning near the stove. You picture the awkwardness of that night, a whole room of people dozing like exhausted statues. The man grins at the memory, though his eyes show he has not forgotten the discomfort. Another traveller, older and quieter, slides into the remaining bed and begins explaining how inns varied widely across regions. Some accounts describe them as lively, almost cheerful refuges, while others portray them as cramped, smoky and poorly ventilated. Researchers who study frontier hospitality often differ on how common each style was. Some believe cheerful inns were rare gems. Others argue they were more frequent than people assume. The travellers in this room shrug when they hear the debate. For them, a roof is a roof. You take a seat on the edge of one of the beds, feeling the mattress sag gently beneath you. The quilt is heavy and smells faintly of wood smoke and lavender sachets someone tucked between the layers. One of the women laughs as she notices your reaction and tells you that many innkeepers scented bedding with dried herbs. Not for luxury, but to mask the odours left by so many bodies passing through. She lifts her own quilt and reveals a small linen pouch stitched near the corner. When she squeezes it, a soft fragrance rises, part floral and part earthy. You look around as the room settles into nighttime rhythms. Boots are arranged near the door in a chaotic mosaic. Travellers shake out coats, hang scarves to dry and pull socks over cold-tired feet. The older man tucks his belongings under his mattress, explaining that good sleepers do not leave valuables where curious hands might wander. He softens the warning with a smile, not accusing anyone present, but acknowledging that inns attracted all sorts. Downstairs, laughter echoes faintly, followed by the clatter of a dropped mug. Someone apologises loudly, and a chorus of good-natured teasing follows. The atmosphere feels communal, improvised, warm. People talk about tomorrow's weather, about frozen rivers, about towns farther north where snowbanks swallow windows. They are strangers, yet tonight they share the same breath of warmth. A traveller settles beside you and rolls up his sleeves to show you a faded tattoo. He says he spent one winter in a mining town where the inn made nightly rounds, through its rooms bringing heated irons to slip between blankets. He admits the irons sometimes scorched the fabric, but everyone appreciated the brief surge of heat. You imagine the rush of warmth spreading through cold quilts, the sudden sighs of relief. The innkeeper enters again and dims the lantern. The room softens into a muted glow. The hum of voices below fades gradually as people drift towards sleep. The mattresses rustle as bodies shift. Someone coughs twice. Someone else mutters a good night to no one in particular. You lie back and feel the quilt settle over you, its weight pressing you gently into the mattress. The warmth here is not the steady heat of a private cabin, but something living, shared human. You hear steady breathing around you, the soft snores of a man already asleep, the quiet sighs of a woman settling deeper into her blankets. As your eyes adjust to the dimness, the cold lurking outside seems distant. The wind rattles the shutters, but the scores of breaths inside blend into a protective hum. Even the floor creaks feel comforting in this crowded room. Eventually you rise quietly and step into the hallway. The air is colder here, but you feel the echoes of warmth following you. When you step outside, the inn glows like a lantern in a field of snow voices muffled behind its wooden walls. You tighten your coat and head onward, feeling the warm memory of shared sleep fading slowly as the cold returns to claim the night. You walk away from the bustling inn, following a stretch of road etched faintly across the frozen plain. The world around you feels quieter again, less crowded, more intimate. A low cluster of cabins appears ahead, set close to one another, as if huddling for warmth. As you approach, the smell of freshly split wood lingers in the air, mingling with the cool sharpness of night. Tonight you are stepping into the sheer exhaustion that winter work carved into people, a kind of bone-deep weariness that shaped how they slept, how they breathed, and how they survived. A man waves you over from a porch where he is finishing the last swing of his axe. The blade bites into a log with a satisfying crack that echoes across the snow. When he sees you studying the pile beside him, he grins ruefully. Wood was life out here, and winter demanded staggering amounts of it. Many surviving accounts mention households burning through cords of firewood so fast that chopping became a nearly daily chore, even when temperatures plunged. He sets the axe aside and invites you into the cabin. The door closes behind you with a heavy thud. Inside, the warmth wraps around you instantly, but not in a gentle way. It is the kind of warmth that comes from relentless work, from sweat drying quickly in the heat of the stove. You look around and see the signs of a long day. Boots streaked with mud and ice rest near the hearth. Coats damp from melted snow hang over chairs. A kettle rattles softly on the stove, its lid dancing with steam. The man's wife greets you with a tired smile. Her hands are red from washing clothes in near-freezing water earlier. She motions for you to sit at the small table. A bowl of thick porridge sits waiting, sprinkled with some kind of dried fruit. When you taste it, sweetness blooms just enough to remind you that food meant warmth as much as nourishment. As you eat, the couple begins to describe their daily winter routine. Chopping wood, hauling water, mending fences buried beneath drifts, feeding livestock twice as often because the animals burn more energy in the cold. Even simple chores stretch into hours. They laugh softly when they mention that by the time supper ends, most people fall asleep standing up if they stop moving long enough. While you listen, the man shows you something curious tucked near the stove, a pair of heavy wool mittens stuffed with clean ashes. He explains that after a long day, his hands ache from gripping tools in the cold. He warms the ashes in the oven, then presses his hands into the mittens. The warmth seeps in slowly and eases the tightness. You slip your hand inside one and feel it a deep, gentle heat, unlike anything from direct flame. It is a small comfort born of necessity. You ask whether all homesteaders worked at this exhausting pace during winter. The man shrugs thoughtfully. Records from the time show that some families had enough hired help to distribute the workload, while others nearly collapsed under the weight of nightly chores. Researchers sometimes disagree about whether certain regions faced harsher winter routines than others. Some suggest plain settlers struggled most because of relentless winds, while others argue that mountain families worked harder because of steep terrain and deeper snowfall. Listening to this couple, the differences blur. Winter, no matter where you stood, demanded more than people felt they had. The wife stands and begins preparing their bedding. She shakes out a thick quilt stitched with dark patches, each square a memory of someone's worn garment. She spreads the quilt across the bed frame and tucks the edges beneath the mattress. When she gestures for you to touch it, you feel the fabric's weight far heavier than you expect. She tells you that heavy quilts helped exhausted bodies rest more deeply, almost like a comforting hold. Some settlers even added extra layers not just for warmth but to create a sense of security after long days in the cold. Two children wander into the room rubbing their eyes. Their cheeks glow with warmth from the fire, but their shoulders slump with fatigue. They curl against each other on a small cot, murmuring half-formed words before slipping towards sleep. Their father chuckles when he sees them, explaining that winter work for children included gathering kindling, carrying small buckets of water, and checking for cracks in the walls where snow might sneak in. They learned early that everyone contributed. You notice another unusual detail when the wife prepares a pot for tomorrow's chores. She tosses a handful of herbs into the water before setting it near the stove to warm overnight. The faint herbal scent fills the room. She says the mixture soothes soreness when they bathe or wash their feet. She learned it from a neighbour who claimed the herbs kept frostbite at bay. Whether the claim was true or not mattered less than the comfort it brought after a grueling day. The conversation quiets as the couple begin settling the room for the night. The fire is banked its glow, dimming to embers. The man folds his coat into a makeshift pillow while the wife straightens the sleeping space. Their movements slow, measured softened by fatigue. Every sound in the cabin feels heavier, as though even the floorboards are tired. You sit for a moment longer, watching the couple pause beside their children. The mother smooths her daughter's hair. The father adjusts the boy's blanket. These small gestures carry more weight after such a long day. Winter exhaustion often brought families closer, their shared weariness knitting them together like the layers of quilts on their beds. The cabin grows quieter still. The stove ticks as metal cools. The wind hums gently outside. The couple sits at the edge of their bed, their bodies sagging with the kind of fatigue that arrives only after true labour. They offer you a small smile of farewell before settling beneath their heavy quilt. When you step outside, the cold wraps around you again, crisp and alert. But you carry their tired warmth with you as you continue down the trail, understanding now how sleep became more than rest in the winter west. It became a refuge earned through toil, a deep release that only exhaustion could unlock. You follow the winding track toward a small homestead, its windows dim and quiet beneath the moon. As you draw closer, you notice a low wooden box half tucked under the front cabin window. It looks like a drawer pulled out from a piece of furniture, its sides reinforced with old metal brackets. A faint glow escapes from the cracks around its lid. Tonight you're entering the intimate world of children's sleeping spaces, where trundle beds, small cots and hidden compartments turned winter nights into cosy dens carved out of necessity. You push the cabin door open gently. Inside, the warmth sits low and steady, fed by a stove that hums like a contented animal. A mother looks up from mending a wool sock and greets you with a welcoming nod. Her children are already preparing for bed. The younger one, small enough that the quilt draped over their shoulders nearly touches the floor, toddles toward that wooden drawer outside the window's reach. The mother chuckles as she notices your curiosity and taps the lid. With a practiced gesture, she pulls the entire contraption forward. It glides from beneath the main bed and settles onto the floorboards with a soft thud. So, this is the trundle bed, the frontier's version of a child's nighttime nest. Many households mentioned contraptions like this in their letters, simple wooden frames on casters or runners that could slide out at night and tuck away by morning to free up precious floor space. The child crawls inside with an eager wiggle, rearranging a patchwork quilt that has clearly been loved through many winters. When you touch the quilt, it feels thick and warm, the stitches slightly uneven, a sign that several hands have helped repair it over the years. The older sibling stands by the main bed, folding blankets neatly. They glance at you shyly, then point to the trundle with a grin as though showing off a secret fort. The mother lifts the lid of a small box sitting at the foot of the trundle. Inside lie 2 smooth stones wrapped in cloth. She presses one into your hands. It is warm from being placed near the stove earlier. She explains that these stones slide under the trundle mattress to keep the cold floor from leaching the children's heat. She chuckles again, adding that if she forgets to warm them, the children remind her loudly. You realize that warmth for little ones was as much emotional comfort as physical necessity. You glance around the cabin. In the corner stands a narrow cot used when extra family members stay over. Its frame is thin, but the mattress piled atop it looks surprisingly soft. The mother tells you that families often rearrange sleeping spaces during winter. Children rotated between trundles, cots, and sometimes even the foot of the parent's bed depending on the temperature. She points at a quilt hanging on the wall. It serves as a draft barrier, but she smiles and admits the children like to pretend it is a magical curtain that guards their sleep. A nearby shelf holds several tiny treasures: a carved wooden horse, a handful of dried berries, a small cloth doll with button eyes. The older child proudly lifts the doll and shows you its wool dress, explaining that their grandmother rubbed the doll with lavender leaves before bedtime. That scent, faint yet soothing, lingers in the fabric even now. Such little comforts rarely appeared in official records, but stories passed down through families often mentioned similar bedtime rituals that help children drift into sleep despite the cold. The mother sits beside you and begins tucking herbs into a cloth sachet she plans to hide under the trundle mattress. She explains that a neighbour swore certain plants helped children breathe more easily during harsh winters. She admits she does it out of habit more than belief, but the familiar fragrance brings her comfort. While she works, she remarks that different communities had different practices for children's sleep. Some historians describe extended families sharing large sleeping benches, while others point to households that made distinct spaces for each child. She shrugs gently, acknowledging the lack of a single picture. Frontier life bent to the needs of each family rather than adhering to strict patterns. The older child finishes arranging the main bed and invites you to help pull the trundle closer to the stove. You grasp the wooden frame and tug. It slides smoothly, guided by worn runners that have become polished from years of nightly use. The warmth grows stronger in the small space, and you can imagine how comforting this would feel to a child who spent the day helping with chores in the cold. Both children now settle into their sleeping spots. The younger one clutches the cloth doll eyes already half closed. The older child crawls under the main quilt, pulling it up to their chin with a practiced flick. The mother checks their blankets, smoothing the edges and adjusting the pillows with a tenderness that softens the room's shadows. She whispers quiet instructions: stay covered, stay warm, call softly if the fire dims too much. You watch as the children's breathing slows. The trundle bed now warmed from both the stone beneath it and the stove nearby glows softly in the lamplight. The wooden sides form a protective shell, giving the sense of a tiny burrow. The older child's cot feels inviting, too, blanketed in the heavy rhythm of a long winter evening. Before dimming the lantern, the mother invites you to look at a curious item hanging near the window, a string of tiny bells fastened loosely along the sill. She explains that when the wind blows from a certain direction, the bells jingle lightly, reminding her that cold air is slipping through a gap. She mends the wall accordingly the next day. She laughs softly, acknowledging that some people consider such tricks overly fussy, while others swear by them. You admire the practicality hidden within the charm. As night deepens, the mother lowers the lantern wick until only a soft pool of light remains. The children sleep easily protected by their quilts, their stones, their trundle bed tucked near the fire like a secret den. You rise quietly and step outside. The cold bites harder than before, but something in you carries the warmth of that little room, the careful arrangements, the children's soft breaths, the small rituals that transformed harsh nights into snug ones. You continue down the snowy path, your steps softened by the memory of a trundle bed glowing like a tiny hearth in the dark. You follow a winding path that dips between clusters of snow-heavy pines until the scent of warm broth and dried herbs drifts toward you. The air here feels softer somehow, carrying hints of cedar smoke and something sweet that you cannot quite name. Ahead, a small cabin glows like a lantern in the woods. Tonight you enter a world of homemade remedies and improvised winter cures, the strange comforting and sometimes questionable methods frontier families relied upon to ease nighttime chills, sore throats, and the aches carved into their bones by long, icy days. You step inside and find a small family gathered around a table cluttered with jars. Each jar contains something steeped or powdered or preserved herbs bundled in twine, soft animal fats, dried berries, roots knotted like twisted fingers. A kettle simmers over the fire, sending thin curls of fragrant steam into the room. The mother stirs it slowly, then smiles at you with the weary kindness of someone who has spent many winters helping her family stay warm and well. She hands you a cup filled with a dark, earthy brew. When you take a sip, you taste winter itself. Piney notes of faint sweetness and a bite of something bitter. She explains that her own mother prepared this mixture each winter, using ingredients gathered during the warmer months. Similar recipes appear in a handful of handwritten household notebooks that survived from the period, often combining local plants with whatever spices happened to be available through trading posts. These mixtures were not official medicines, yet many families leaned on them every night. While you warm your hands around the cup, the father retrieves a small crock from a shelf. He opens it with a flourish and reveals a thick salve made from tallow blended with herbs. Its scent is sharp, almost minty. He chuckles as he spreads a dab on the back of your hand. It is warm, not from heat, but from something in the mixture that tingles the skin. He explains that they rub it on their chests and necks before bed to ease breathing during harsh winter nights. A few old diaries mention similar salves, though ingredients varied wildly depending on region and family tradition. The couple's eldest daughter brings over a small cloth pouch, tied neatly with red string. She places it into your hand and encourages you to smell it. You inhale a mixture of dried petals, juniper needles, and something resinous that clings to your senses. She explains that the pouch is tucked into bedding each night because the scent helps calm her younger siblings. A neighbouring family taught them the technique, saying the fragrance soothed restless children when storms rattled the cabin. You can imagine the quiet relief such a scent might bring during long nights when the wind screeches like an animal outside. As you examine the pouch, the mother begins recounting how winter ailments shaped nightly routines. She says that a simple cough, if ignored, could linger for weeks, keeping the entire household awake. Her solution is the remedy simmering in the kettle, a combination of honey pine sap and boiled bark. Written memories from dispersed settlements hint at similar concoctions, suggesting that these recipes spread through conversation rather than any formal teaching. You ask whether such treatments were common across the West. The father scratches his beard thoughtfully. He says that stories he has heard from travelling peddlers paint different pictures. Some areas relied heavily on herbal knowledge, drawn from indigenous neighbours, while others leaned on imported patent medicines, sold in brightly labelled bottles. Researchers who study frontier healthcare have noted these disparities too, though sources often contradict one another. Some suggest herbal remedies dominated rural life, while others argue that store-bought tonics were more widespread than people recall. Listening to this family, you sense the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. A soft cough rises from a small bed in the corner. The mother moves toward her youngest child, who lies curled beneath a thick quilt. She dips a cloth into the warm salve and rubs it gently along the child's back. The room fills with a soothing aroma. You notice how tenderly she works, pressing warmth into the child's skin as though willing the discomfort to leave. She explains that warmth is the most important remedy of all. No matter the ingredients or traditions, keeping a sick child warm through the night was always the primary goal. On a shelf nearby sits a jar of something pale and thick. You pick it up carefully and ask about its purpose. The father grins sheepishly and admits it is an old family mixture, tallow blended with onions and a pinch of pepper. He points to his own chest, laughing lightly, and says it is rubbed on the skin to ease congestion. It is not a widely known method, but he insists it helped him sleep through storms as a boy. The smell is strong enough to make your eyes water, and you set the jar down gently. A moment later, the eldest daughter brings over a curious item, a strip of flannel warmed by the stove. She wraps it loosely around her wrist to demonstrate. She explains that their neighbour swears that warm flannel wrapped around wrists or ankles helps draw heat into the body. Whether the logic holds up scientifically is uncertain, but many frontier families adopted similar rituals simply because they felt comforting. You run the soft, warm fabric between your fingers and understand the appeal. The mother then reaches under the table and presents a small wooden box filled with dried berries. She calls them sleep berries, with a wink, though she clarifies they are nothing magical. They are simply dried choke cherries, preserved with a dusting of sugar. Eating a few before bed supposedly helps settle the stomach. A handful of winter journals mention similar snacks, small treats meant to ease discomfort and bring a moment of simple pleasure before facing another cold night. While the family prepares their bedding, you watch their subtle rituals unfold. The father hangs a small bundle of herbs above the bedpost. The mother sprinkles a pinch of dried mint near the stove. The children sip warm broth from wooden cups. These small acts woven together create a sense of safety no matter how fierce the wind becomes. As bedtime nears, the cabin grows quieter. The kettle stops steaming. The fire settles into a calm orange glow. The mother tucks the herb pouch under the youngest child's pillow, then places warm stones around the foot of the bed. The father lowers the lamplight until the room swims in gold. The family offers you a warm smile before settling into their quilts. Their breathing slows the remedies, working their quiet magic through the stillness. You step outside, carrying with you the lingering scent of herbs. The cold wraps around you again, sharp but familiar. You walk on, thinking about how warmth, care, and creativity shaped every winter night on this frontier. You continue down the path until the snow begins to whisper under your boots in a different way, as though the night itself wants to warn you of something small and persistent. Ahead stands a low cabin, with its door slightly ajar and lamplight spilling across the threshold. When you step inside, you immediately notice it, the faint, restless rustling that frontier families dreaded during winter, just as much as bitter wind. Tonight, you enter the world of the tiny sleep thieves that thrived in cramped, heated cabins when cold weather forced everyone indoors, fleas, lice, and other unwelcome companions that turned long nights into itchy battlegrounds. The air is warm and thick with the scent of wool and tallow. A family sits around the stove finishing their evening chores. When they see you, they wave you closer with tired smiles. The father scratches his arm absent-mindedly while the mother shakes out a blanket near the fire. Tiny specks dance loose, catching the lamplight. She sighs in resignation and mutters that winter brings out not only the need for warmth, but the need for constant vigilance against the smallest creatures. As you sit, the father explains that crowded winter sleeping arrangements often encouraged pests to settle in. Notes in old family letters often describe winter nights filled with scratching, shaking out bedding, and checking seams for tiny movements. Without modern laundry methods, cold weather only worsened the problem. Fabric stayed damp longer. Bedding stayed layered thickly. Everyone shared the same heat, which unfortunately meant everything else shared it too. The mother brings over a wooden box and opens it. Inside lies a handful of herbs, rosemary, juniper, and something that smells sharply of pine. She rubs a bit between her fingers and sprinkles it onto the bedding. She says her grandmother swore the scent discouraged pests from nesting. Though there is no written rule from the time saying this was common practice, a few family journals do mention similar herbal mixtures scattered into blankets before sleep. You breathe in the fragrance and feel its pleasant sting. Meanwhile, the eldest daughter points out a curious item hanging above the bed, a small strip of cloth brushed with melted soap and left to dry stiff. She explains that her father drags it across the seams of quilts, where pests tend to hide. When cold nights drive people to pile on every available blanket, tiny invaders slip into warm creases. This soap-treated cloth trick, she says proudly, is their family's own invention. You ask whether every frontier home struggled with pests in winter. The father shrugs thoughtfully. He says conversations with neighbours paint different pictures. Some families speak of routine infestations, while others insist they hardly noticed any issues. Modern researchers, he adds, seem divided on how widespread these problems were. Some argue that tightly packed cabins inevitably attracted pests during cold seasons, while others point to evidence suggesting households developed effective preventative habits. The father shakes his head with a weary smile. He says the truth probably depends on the building, the bedding, and a little bit of luck. The youngest child wanders over carrying a woolen nightshirt. She holds it out for you to see. It is patched in several places, worn soft by frequent use. When she flips it inside out, you notice seams rubbed smooth from being scrubbed again and again. The mother explains that frequent washing was nearly impossible in winter because water froze so quickly, so garments were often brushed vigorously near the fire instead. She picks up a stiff bristle brush and demonstrates whisking it across the wool until tiny flecks fall to the floor. A sudden scurry along the wall catches your eye. A mouse darts across the floorboards and disappears beneath a cabinet. The family sighs in unison. Winter chases animals indoors just as it chases people. The father grabs a small tin cup, lifts it, and reveals a bit of grain tucked underneath. He says they leave bait in places where mice might distract themselves rather than bothering sleeping humans. It sounds almost humorous until you imagine lying under quilts, while something tiny scampers across your toes. One unusual detail catches your attention. Hanging above the stove is a small tin filled with ashes. The mother takes a pinch and sprinkles it across the rag rug beside the bed. She explains that ashes make it easier to spot small pests crawling across the floor, light specks on dark fabric, a surprisingly clever trick. She tells you she learned it from an older neighbour, who believed that ash also carried a scent pests disliked. Whether that part is true or not she cannot say, but she continues the tradition anyway. The family turns their attention to preparing the bedding. They lift the quilts and give them a firm shake near the open door to let loose pests fall outside. The cold air rushes in, biting your face, but the mother slams the door quickly once the shaking is done. She spreads the quilts, neatly smoothing the edges. She urges her children to check their sleeves and collars before climbing into bed. Lice were particularly stubborn in winter, finding warmth wherever it lingered. The children turn their clothing inside out, beat the fabric lightly, and laugh at each other's messy hair. The father then hands you a small wooden comb with narrow teeth. He explains that people use such combs at night to run through their hair before sleep. It was not a guarantee of cleanliness, but it reduced the chance of pests settling in. You drag the comb through a strand of your hair, feeling the fine teeth tug slightly. You imagine how many nights families must have sat exactly where you are combing, brushing, shaking, and hoping for even a little relief. The fire begins to dim. Embers settle into a low red glow. The family gathers around the bed, their movements gentle and practiced. The mother tucks warm stones near the children's feet. The father pulls the quilts up high, sealing in warmth. The children nestle close, yawning softly. Despite all the tiny interruptions winter brought, sleep eventually folded around households like this one, woven from effort rather than ease. You rise quietly, stepping over the bristle brush and herbal bowl on your way out. When you open the door, the cold rushes in with a fierce gust, as if eager to claim any warmth still lingering inside. You step into the night and pull your coat tight. Behind you, the cabin grows still. The rustle of pests, the brushing of fabric, the scurry of a mouse, all fade into the gentle hush of sleeping voices. You walk onward, carrying with you the reminder that winter on the frontier demanded vigilance, not only against storms and frost, but against the littlest creatures that crept into the warmth. You leave the pest-troubled cabin behind and walk into a stretch of land where the snowdrifts look deeper and smoother, as if no one has tread here for days. The air has a heavy stillness to it, thick with the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound intrusive. You notice the horizon fading into a pale blur. Snow begins to fall slow at first, then faster, swirling with a restless urgency. Tonight you are stepping into the profound claustrophobic reality of storm weeks, those long stretches when families remain trapped indoors, while winter threw its full weight against the walls. By the time you reach the next homestead, the storm has gathered enough force to push against your coat like a living thing. The cabin door opens quickly when you knock, almost as though the family inside feared losing any heat if they hesitated. You stumble inside and let the door slam shut. At once you feel swallowed by warmth, sound, and movement. A family of 5 occupies the room, each person busy with small tasks as the storm screeches outside. The father is reinforcing the shutters with short wooden slats. He nods toward the window where snow slaps the glass with the vigour of thrown handfuls. He mutters that storms like this can last days, sometimes weeks. Old farm logs from the region often describe these stretches as the long white periods when families ration not only food but patience. You hear the same sentiment in his voice as he wedges another slat into place, sealing the window tighter. The mother tends a bubbling pot of stew, her hands moving automatically. The children sit near the fire, not playing but watching the flames with a mixture of awe and restlessness. One waves a small stick in the air, pretending it is a tiny sword slicing through the storm's howl. You take a seat beside them and let the fire's heat sink into your stiff fingers. The father turns toward you and explains that being snowed in can warp your sense of time. Morning looks like evening, and evening feels like another kind of morning. Without the rhythms of outdoor chores or sunlight, people rely on the fire, the kettle, and the shifting wind for any sense of the day. In several frontier letters, storm weeks are described not as events, but as conditions like waiting inside the belly of something big and unpredictable. To pass the time, the mother pulls out a deck of cards softened by countless hands. She deals them across the table, inviting you to join. The children cheer and climb onto chairs. The game begins clumsily, laughter floating through the haze of cabin smoke. You notice how quickly these moments change the atmosphere. Cabin fever, though they do not call it, that lurks at the edges, but shared activity keeps it at bay. As the game continues, the father fetches a small wooden board from a shelf. Carved into its surface is a grid pattern. He tells you it is an old homemade strategy game learned from a neighbour years ago. He sets tiny pebbles on the board and shows you how to play. The rules are simple yet absorbing. Tiny diversions like this appear sporadically in historical accounts, revealing how families created their own entertainment during long storms. Not everything written about winter highlights hardship. Many notes hint at creativity, storytelling, and improvised games carved from boredom. The youngest child tugs at your sleeve and points to the wall opposite the fire. A long strip of cloth hangs there, covered in faint charcoal markings. The mother explains that they draw small pictures on the cloth during each storm, adding a new one every day. Little animals, stick figures, Stars and shapes fill the fabric, turning it into a visual diary of being trapped indoors. It is a curious tradition you have not seen elsewhere, likely unique to this family's imagination. You ask how different families handled storm weeks. The father folds his arms and considers. He says some neighbours stayed active fixing tools or weaving rope, while others simply waited the days out in near silence. Accounts from various regions paint contrasting pictures. Some describe storm-bound households as lively, filled with stories and chores. Others depict them as strained people, pacing near walls or arguing over small inconveniences. Even modern researchers cannot agree on whether winter isolation strengthened families or frayed them. The family before you seems to lean toward harmony, though you sense hints of fatigue in their faces. Another gust hits the cabin so hard that dust shakes loose from the rafters. The children squeal, half alarmed, half delighted. The mother laughs and assures them the structure is sturdy. She stirs the pot again and lifts a small ladle of steaming broth to your lips. The taste is rich, comforting, and slightly spicy. She explains that she adds dry pepper to warm the body faster. You can feel the heat spreading through you like a soft flame. The storm's rhythm continues like a drum beat. Snow ricochets off the walls with steady force. A lamp flickers. The shutters rattle. The family responds like a seasoned crew aboard a ship. The father inspects the walls for drafts. The mother checks the stew. The children huddle closer. You feel the cabin tighten into its own heartbeat, resilient against the storm's demands. As night deepens, the activities wind down. The father lowers the lamp wick. The children yawn, rubbing their eyes. The mother hangs the cooking pot near the fire to keep it warm for morning. You watch the quiet choreography of settling in. Bundles of quilts appear. Cushions are adjusted and sleeping corners are made from thick rugs and folded coats. You help move a low bench closer to the hearth so the children can sleep near the warmth. The father sets a small clay pot filled with coals inside a metal dish and places it beneath the sleeping area. The gentle heat rising from it makes the quilts puff slightly like warm breath. You have seen people use heated stones before, but this is a new technique for you. One of those small survival solutions families invented during long storms. The mother sits at the edge of the room and begins humming a slow, soothing line. The children's eyelids droop. Her voice blends with the crackle of the fire and the muted roar of the storm outside. The cabin feels wrapped in a cocoon of sound and warmth. When the children are finally asleep, the parents sit beside the fire speaking in low tones. They glance at the window now and then as though measuring the storm's strength by instinct. You can sense the mix of concern and routine in their expressions. Storm weeks test every part of life supplies, patience, sleep, and spirit. Eventually you stand and thank them quietly. The father walks you to the door, opening it only a sliver so the wind does not rush in all at once. Snow swirls past like dust in a whirlwind. The air outside stings your face instantly. You step into the storm, letting the cold claim you again. Behind you the cabin glows softly, pulsing like a heartbeat inside the raging white. You continue through the snowfall until you reach a narrow clearing where the moonlight glints off a clothesline strung between two crooked posts. This sight stops you for a moment. Frozen garments hang stiff as boards their shapes caught mid-flutter. You step closer and hear them creak faintly in the cold breeze. Ahead a cabin glows with low lamplight, and from inside comes the soft rasp of fabric being brushed or folded. Tonight you enter the winter world of frontier clothing. The layers people relied on to sleep, to work, and simply to endure when homes and blankets alone could not hold back the cold. The door opens as you approach. A woman bundled in several mismatched layers waves you inside, her sleeves darkened where melted frost has soaked into the wool. The room feels warm, but not overwhelmingly so. It carries the steady heat of a stove running all day long, and the air smells faintly of damp cloth sheep's wool and pine smoke. Inside, her husband sits near the hearth repairing a pair of heavy trousers. He works with slow precision, threading a thick needle through worn fibres. He lifts the garment for you to see. The knees and seat are patched with different shades of wool and leather, creating a landscape of repairs. He remarks that families rarely owned many sets of clothes. so sleeping in daytime garments was common during harsh winters. Notes from period travellers occasionally mention waking with the texture of wool imprinted on their skin because they slept fully dressed night after night. Behind him, 2 children sit cross-legged on the floor, pulling dry socks close to the stove. Every pair looks handmade, some thick and bulky, others thin and uneven. The mother laughs softly as she notices your curiosity. She explains that these socks must be dried daily. Even the slightest dampness becomes dangerous at night. Cold toes were more than uncomfortable. They could stiffen enough to make walking painful come morning. As the children arrange their socks, the father picks up a hooded garment from a peg. It is a coat sewn from old wool blankets stitched together like puzzle pieces. He invites you to try it on. The weight surprises you. It feels heavy in a reassuring way, warming your shoulders within seconds. He explains that such coats often doubled as sleep coverings in especially cold stretches. You imagine lying under a patched blanket coat, its weight pressing you gently toward rest. While you examine the coat, the mother retrieves something unusual from a small chest. She unwraps a square of cloth embedded with wax and soft fur. She explains that people sometimes stitched bits of rabbit fur into the inner lining of nightcaps and collars for extra warmth. You stroke the fur and feel how quickly it retains heat. She chuckles and says her grandmother insisted rabbit fur made dreams warmer, though she admits she cannot prove that claim. You ask about winter clothing habits across different communities. The father rests his needle on the table and thinks for a moment. He says that stories from travellers passing through the region often conflict about how heavily people layered clothes. Some swear that settlers wore nearly every garment they owned indoors, while others describe families who maintained lighter layers thanks to better insulated homes or stronger stoves. Writers who studied frontier textiles also draw differing conclusions. Some suggest clothing was the primary shield against cold nights, while others emphasize bedding and architectural design as more decisive. Hearing his explanation, you sense how personal experience shaped the truth as much as climate or construction. The children begin sorting garments into neat piles. You watch them pair socks, fold undershirts, and shake out long woolen scarves. Their movements are efficient, their faces serious. Winter taught even the youngest how to care for clothing because neglecting it meant cold seeping into every seam. One child proudly shows you a shirt mended with uneven stitches. He points out the spots where he tried sewing for the first time. You notice the crooked lines, but you also see how effectively they hold the fabric together. Meanwhile, the mother kneels near the stove and flips a long wool skirt draped over a wooden chair. She taps the fabric, testing if it has dried fully. When she stands, the skirt emits a faint crackle, as though the fibres are loosening after a long rigid afternoon. She folds it carefully, smoothing it with her palms. She tells you that skirts, coats and trousers often froze stiff when hung outside, sometimes taking nearly a day to soften again by the fire. She then shows you something even more peculiar, a pair of mittens filled with down feathers. She explains that she made them for sleeping rather than outdoor use. The mittens are soft, almost cloud-like, and she smiles as she presses them into your hands. She sees they help when the nights become bitter enough to make fingers sting under quilts. Whether this idea came from a neighbour or from her own experimentation she cannot remember, but the warmth feels immediate and soothing. The father resumes sewing the needle, sliding through thick fabric with a soft thump. He glances toward the window where frost spreads across the glass like white lace. He mentions that on nights like this, clothing warmed by the fire before sleep becomes essential. He points to a long wooden rod leaning against the stove. They drape garments across it during the evening so they are warmer when worn to bed. You imagine slipping into preheated layers, letting the warmth settle around you as you curl beneath quilts. The children, now ready for sleep, begin layering themselves. A long undershirt first, then the thick socks dried earlier, then a woolen nightcap for each. When they settle onto the bed, the mother tucks extra scarves around their shoulders. The children giggle at the snugness, but neither protests. They seem accustomed to becoming small bundles of layered fabric each night. As the family prepares to rest, the father places a few garments near the stove to warm for the morning. He stacks them, carefully, socks at the top, shirts in the middle, coats folded at the bottom. He says that waking to cold clothes can drain a person's will before dawn. Better to slip into something warm, even if only for a few seconds. The mother dims the lantern. Shadows drape gently over the room. The layered clothing on pegs and chairs resembles sleeping bodies of its own resting from a long day of work. The stove glows softly, sending a final wave of heat into the space. You step outside into the crisp air. The clothesline sways its frozen garments whispering in the breeze. You hear them creak softly like distant voices calling across time. You move on, warmed by the memory of thick socks, patched coats, and the quiet ritual of preparing for another long frontier night. You follow the forest edge until the smell of something rich and savoury drifts through the trees, slipping into the cold air like a promise. Your stomach tightens at the scent, and you realise how deeply hunger shapes the way bodies feel warmth. Ahead, a small cabin huddles beside a frozen creek. The glow from its window flickers with the steady rhythm of a fire that has been tended carefully, lovingly all day. Tonight you step into the heart of winter, cooking the quiet truth that what people ate determined how well they slept, how warm they stayed, and how their bodies endured the long punishing nights. When you enter, a family sits gathered around a wooden table. Steam rises from bowls placed before them, carrying the earthy smell of onions, dried herbs, and long simmered fat. The mother gestures for you to come closer. She ladles a serving into a cup and places it in your hands. The warmth immediately seeps into your fingers. As you taste it, you feel the thick broth spreading comfort through your chest. The father explains that hearty winter meals were not a luxury, they were a necessity. In several early settlement journals, people describe eating heavier suppers during cold months to maintain body heat through the night. The father taps his bowl and says that heat starts on the tongue, a phrase he likely inherited from someone who learned it by experience rather than study. You look into the pot simmering near the fire, noticing chunks of root vegetables softened into buttery shapes. The mother tells you she cooked them in tallow earlier, letting the fat coat every piece. Frontier families often relied on animal fat not because it was fashionable, but because it was energy-dense and slow-burning. She sets aside a jar filled with rendered tallow stored from the previous season, explaining that her family uses it for everything: cooking, greasing pans, sealing drafts, even rubbing onto cracked hands before sleep. The eldest son brings you a small wooden spoon dipped in a darker mixture. It tastes smoky, rich, and slightly sweet. He grins and tells you it is stew thickener, a mixture of dried berries mashed with a little flour. You raise your eyebrows and he laughs, admitting it is not common everywhere. His grandfather taught him the recipe, insisting it helped to keep the stomach quiet through the night. Whether this wisdom holds any practical truth is uncertain, but its flavour is oddly soothing, and you can imagine it being repeated through generations simply because it felt right. You ask how different families approached winter meals. The father leans back thoughtfully. He explains that travellers brought new recipes from far places, and neighbours shared whatever tricks they discovered. Written records from various regions often disagree about which foods defined frontier winters. Some accounts emphasize salted meat and potatoes, while others highlight dried corn, winter squash, or preserved berries. The mother shrugs with a soft smile. She says everyone cooked what the land and weather allowed and little else. The children finish their stew quickly and run to fetch a loaf of bread resting near the stove. It is dark and dense, the crust almost chewy from being baked in a small cast-iron pot. When you tear off a corner, a warm, hearty scent fills the air, molasses and rye, perhaps. The mother explains that heavy breads were perfect bedtime food. They sat comfortably in the stomach, releasing warmth slowly. She says this with the confidence of someone who has seen it work night after night. The father then reveals something unexpected. He opens a small crock filled with a pale gelatinous substance that smells faintly of broth. He dips a spoon into it and spreads it onto a piece of bread before handing it to you. It tastes mild, almost silky. He explains that this is cooled bone broth, rich in fat and minerals stored for nights when someone feels weak or chilled. He chuckles and says it looks unappealing but helps strengthen the spine against the cold. The phrase sounds poetic, but you can imagine the comfort it offered on deep winter nights. As you sit near the stove, you notice the mother adjusting something inside the oven chamber. She lifts a small clay bowl and shows you its contents: roughly chopped apples, dried to leathery slices. She sprinkles them into a pot of boiling water to make a simple warm drink. Apple tea, she explains, helps calm the body. She sees a neighbour claimed it eased the shoulders and lower back after long days of winter chores. Whether this belief came from practical experience or superstition is unclear, but the aroma is soft and soothing. The youngest child wanders over with another surprise: a tiny cloth pouch filled with toasted oats, mixed with a pinch of salt. He says they warm the pouch in the stove and place it beneath their quilts at bedtime. The warm grain smell he adds with pride helps him fall asleep faster. You hold the little pouch and feel its gentle heat. You can imagine children embracing such rituals, turning small comforts into dependable nighttime companions. Later, as the family prepares for bed, the mother offers you a final taste of her winter, cooking a spoonful of something dark and glossy, stored in a small jar. It has the deep flavour of preserved berries and honey. She calls it sweet fire. Just a spoonful before sleep, she says, is enough to warm the chest and soften midnight chills. Whether this is science instinct or merely tradition hardly matters. Its sweetness blooms across your tongue, leaving behind a lingering warmth that spreads down your throat. The family begins arranging their bedding near the stove. The father hangs a kettle filled with tomorrow's stew ingredients so it can thaw slowly overnight. The mother tucks the youngest child beneath a quilt layered over warm stones. The room fills with the soft rustling of fabric, the quiet thump of wooden bowls being stacked, and faint murmurs drifting into the dim lamplight. You stand to leave, feeling the warmth of the stew still pulsing in your fingertips. The family waves you off from their cosy nest of quilts. When you open the door, the cold rushes in with a fierce clarity, but inside your chest lingers the heat of their evening meal. You step into the night again, carrying that warmth like an ember as you walk deeper into winter. You continue along the frozen trail until the trees thin out and the land opens into a wide moonlit stretch of snow. The silence here is so complete, it feels almost delicate, as if one loud breath might crack it. Then in the distance you see faint lantern glow bobbing like a wandering star. Someone is out there moving slowly, scanning the ground with patient eyes. Tonight you step into the old habit of night patrols, that quiet routine in which settlers ventured into the cold to check livestock. Read the tracks left behind by animals and listen for anything unusual beneath the winter sky. You approach the figure and see a man wrapped in a heavy coat, the lantern swinging from his gloved hand. When he notices you, he raises the light and greets you with a quiet nod. He explains that he is making his nightly round, a task shared among family members whenever winter pressed hard against the homestead. In many personal letters from frontier families, people wrote about these midnight walks without drama, describing them as simply another thread woven into the rhythm of survival. He invites you to join him. The snow crunches beneath your boots as you follow his lantern beam. The air is so crisp it sharpens every sound. He pauses to examine a set of tracks pressed into the snow, gesturing for you to look. Their shape is delicate, almost floral each step, leaving a little indentation with pointed toes. He smiles and says those belong to a fox that visits often. Its trail winds toward the edge of the woods, then disappears into shadow. Further along, he kneels beside a fence post half buried in snow. He brushes frost from its surface and checks whether the rail remains secure. Livestock relied on the strength of these fences to stay safe through the night. He tells you about a storm last winter, when drifting snow pushed the rails loose until a cow wandered halfway across the meadow. His dog's frantic barking saved the animal. The memory lingers in his voice, soft but serious. As you continue walking, he holds the lantern low over the snow. You notice a faint ridge where something heavy passed earlier. He squints and explains that it is likely the trail of a neighbour's horse that broke free during the morning. He says night patrols often doubled as quiet reconstructions of the day's unseen events. Footprints, broken twigs and snow patterns became clues for anyone willing to read them. Some settlers even grew adept at identifying the weight and gait of their animals just by the shape of tracks a skill rarely mentioned in formal publications but remembered in family stories. He stops suddenly and raises the lantern higher. You hear a distant groan, long and low, rolling across the open land. He listens carefully before relaxing. It is only the barn roof shifting under the cold, a sound he knows well. He says that winter nights taught people to distinguish between important noises and harmless ones. A groan from timber might mean nothing, or it might warn of snow load that needed clearing before morning. Interpreting such sounds became second nature for those who lived out here long enough. You ask him whether every household performed these night patrols. He considers your question carefully. Some accounts he's heard from travellers describe families who never left the cabin, after dark choosing instead to trust their fences and barns. Others recall communities where someone walked the perimeter every night, especially during hunting season or wolf-heavy winters. He notes that even historians who examine frontier patterns disagree about how common this practice truly was. Weather terrain, livestock size and personal temperament all shape the habit differently from home to home. He leads you farther into the night, pausing again when he spots another trail. This one is wide and shallow, the edges slightly melted. He touches it with the tip of his glove and explains that deer passed here not long ago. The warmth of their bodies has softened the snow. He shows you how to follow the faint arc of their movement, pointing out subtle shifts in texture. You try tracing the line yourself, impressed by how much he sees in impressions you barely notice. A brief wind arrives, tossing powdered snow into the air. The lantern light scatters in fragments dancing across the drifts. He lowers the lantern to shield the flame and tells you about the way wind erases tracks sometimes in seconds. On certain nights, he says patrols become races against the storm. A missing calf could be found only if tracks remained visible. Once wind wiped them away, the search grew nearly impossible. As you approach the barn, the animals inside stir softly. A horse huffs, sending warm breath curling through the slats. A cow shifts her weight, producing a muffled thump. The man enters the barn, briefly checking water buckets and feeling along the animals' coats for cold spots. He explains that winter nights demanded these checks because frozen water or stiff joints could escalate into serious problems by dawn. When he steps back outside, he motions for you to look at the way moonlight glints on the snow near the gate. Fine crystals sparkle like crushed glass. He says that the frost patterns often told him how cold the night would be. Thin, feathery shapes usually appeared before temperature drops, while heavier crystalline clusters often suggested that warmer air would move in by morning. He admits it is not a precise science, but experience made him trust these visual cues. As the two of you turn toward the cabin again, the lantern casts long shadows behind you. The wind has softened and the sky feels enormous, full of stars burning cold and bright. You notice how the man's pace changes as you near home, slower, less guarded. Night patrols were tiring, he says, but they also offered a strange peace. You heard the land breathe. You saw what happened when no one was looking. You learned to trust the quiet. Back at the cabin door, he shakes the snow off his boots and thanks you for keeping him company. Inside, the warm glow of the fire greets you both. He places the lantern on a hook and listens for a moment, ears tuned to the subtle hush of the night now settling outside. You step away from the door once more, leaving him to his evening. The snow beneath your feet absorbs your footsteps and the vast quiet of the frontier night wraps itself around you again. Tracks, wind, breath, silence, they all blend together as you continue forward deeper into winter's long and patient dark. You follow a narrow path where the snow glows pale under the moon, and soon you notice a distant flicker of lamplight through the trees. The air grows still as if holding its breath. When you reach the cabin, a soft moan drifts through the cracked window, the unmistakable sound of someone unwell. Tonight you're stepping into the difficult world of frontier illness during winter nights when a cough or fever became a test of endurance and care, and when sleep arrived only in cautious fragments. You knock lightly and enter. A woman sits beside a low bed where an older man lies beneath layers of blankets. His breath rattles faintly, though his eyes flutter open long enough to acknowledge your presence. The room is warm, but the warmth hangs heavy and uneven, broken by drafts sneaking through the wall seams. The fire burns low, and the mother of the household tends it while murmuring reassurances, A pot of steeping herbs sits on the table. Steam rises in slow spirals, carrying scents of mint pine and something earthy you cannot quite identify. The woman ladles a little into a wooden cup, cools it by blowing softly, and lifts it to the man's lips. In an account written decades ago by a settler's daughter, she described winter ailments as battles fought through patience and improvisation, more than medicine. Looking at this scene, you understand exactly what she meant. The eldest son steps forward and shows you a simple device hanging near the bed, a strip of cloth sprinkled with dried sage and tied at both ends. He dips it briefly into warm water, then drapes it across his father's forehead. He explains that they believe the aroma helps calm restless dreams and eases the tightening of breath. Whether this idea came from a neighbour, a family memory, or trial and error is unclear, but the boy applies it with the confidence of someone who's seen it help before. You ask how illness shaped winter nights in different households. The mother answers quietly. She says that stories shared among neighbours rarely match perfectly. Some families claimed they rarely fell sick thanks to hearty food and good smoke ventilation. Others remembered winters when half the household took turns tending one another. Even recorded travel journals offer contrasting impressions. Some speak of communities where everyone banded together to help the sick, while others describe long nights when each family weathered difficulties alone. The woman reaches for a clay cup filled with heated stones wrapped in cloth. She slides it gently beneath the blanket at the man's feet. The warmth radiates through the coverings and seems to settle his breathing. The practice appears in a few homemaker notes preserved from the era, placing warm stones near the extremities to draw heat back toward the chest. You watch the man's shoulders relax ever so slightly. A small rocking chair sits beside the bed, its worn runners gliding quietly as the teenage daughter moves back and forth. She hums a slow, steady tune that blends rhythmically with the crackling of the fire. The sound fills the room with a kind of assurance. In one family story passed down through generations, a grandmother described similar humming as the winter lullaby, something that comforted both caregiver and patient when the night deepened and hope wavered. The fire shifts as a gust presses against the cabin. Sparks dance upward. The woman sets another log carefully on top. She tells you that sickness always made her wary of the cold sneaking in. Even a few degrees could worsen fevers. She recalls a neighbour recounting how they stretched quilts along the walls to keep icy draughts from reaching a sick child. You look at the cabin walls and notice a quilt hanging in the corner patterned with faded shapes. It seems more than decoration. The son adjusts the pillow, lifting his father's head. Then he brings out a small tin. When he opens it, the aroma is strong and sharp. He rubs a little of the mixture onto the man's chest. It glistens in the lamplight. The scent reminds you of pine and some resin lifted from tree bark. The boy admits that they mixed this remedy from instructions shared by a travelling peddler years ago. Such improvisations show up sporadically in community recollections, though hardly any two families use the same combination. A faint cough shakes the man's body. The mother leans closer and whispers soft encouragement. She dips a cloth in warm water and wipes his face gently. The daughter steadies her, humming the rhythm slow and tender. The boy checks the fire again, then the water basin, then the blanket edges. Their movements feel instinctive, shaped by countless winter nights when care replaced sleep. You ask whether people often stayed awake through such nights. The mother gives a tired smile. She says that on winter nights like these, rest came in brief pieces, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whenever the patient's breathing settled or the fire burned steadily. In a few surviving letters, settlers wrote of patchwork sleep, a phrase that captures perfectly the way night fragmented under the weight of worry. She brings you the herbal mixture again and encourages you to warm your hands over it. The heat is soothing. You inhale the scent and your lungs feel clearer for a moment. You imagine how comforting this must feel to those sick and aching in the night. The older man stirs under the blankets and murmurs a few soft words. The family gathers closer. The mother holds his hand gently. His breathing is steadier now, slow but even. She brushes his hair from his forehead and whispers to him, as though her words themselves carry warmth. The daughter's humming fades into silence at last. She slides from her chair and wraps herself in a shawl, curling up beside the hearth. The boy places another warm stone beneath the blanket. The mother sits down and lets her shoulders rest, her eyes half closing, though she clearly remains alert. The cabin feels softer now, the firelight painting everything with quiet gold. You sense how illness reshaped this family's night into a vigil, tender, anxious and resilient all at once. Every breath of the patient becomes a signal. Every flicker of the fire becomes a reminder. As you rise to leave, the mother thanks you with a weary smile. Outside, the cold greets you sharply, but behind the door remains a pocket of warmth carved by devotion. You continue along the snowy trail, feeling the weight of their care sheltering you as you step deeper into the winter night. You press onward through the frozen night until you notice a cluster of faintly glowing windows gathered around a small wooden structure on a hill. The wind carries the muted rise and fall of voices, not loud or jubilant, but steady, woven together like threads in a winter blanket. As you draw closer, you realize you're approaching a gathering place used by nearby families during the coldest months. Tonight, you step inside one of the community assemblies that helped settlers endure long winters, small religious meetings, and shared devotions that doubled as sources of warmth, companionship, and sleep-softening comfort. The door opens easily when you push it. A breath of warm air greets you, rich with the smell of wool coats, drying pine logs burning, and something faintly sweet perhaps, baked apples cooling on a table. Inside, a small crowd fills the room. Some sit on benches, others stand near the stove, and still others huddle close to family members for warmth. A soft hum of singing threads through the space, lifting the mood gently. A man at the front nods to you and welcomes you with a smile. His voice has the steady tone of someone used to speaking during storms. He says that midwinter gatherings like this give their minds purpose when darkness lingers too long outside. In several regional memory accounts, such winter meetings are mentioned as essential moments of shared support. Not grand ceremonies, but modest circles warmed by fire and familiar voices. You take a seat near a stove radiating a steady glow. A small group stands beside you, adjusting scarves and rubbing their hands near the heat. A young girl leans over to show you her mitten-covered fingers. She wiggles them proudly and explains that she knit the mittens herself while practicing a hymn. You laugh softly, touched by her enthusiasm. She tells you this hall often doubles as a place for lessons, mending, reading aloud, or simply resting near others on long nights. As the singing pauses, the leader begins speaking in a quiet tone. His words are gentle, encouraging gratitude and patience during difficult times. He reminds the assembly that winters test both body and spirit. Listening to him, you remember reading somewhere that frontier congregations often emphasized endurance and unity more than doctrine during winter months. Hearing the murmured responses around you, you can imagine how affirming such moments must have felt. Beside you, an old woman whispers a small anecdote. She recalls gatherings from her childhood when families arrived with frozen boots wrapped in cloth, and they warmed their feet together by the stove while sharing stories. She smiles wistfully and points toward the stove where several pairs of boots now lean in a messy row. It is a small detail, but seeing the steam rise from the thawing leather feels deeply human, a reminder that these assemblies served as places of simple recovery. While the gathering continues, a young man seated behind you pulls a tiny tin from his pocket and opens it. Inside are wax strips of cloth infused with some fragrant oil. He rubs a bit onto his palms and breathes deeply. He explains that his family uses the scent to stay alert when meetings stretch long into the night. He offers this tin for you to smell. The fragrance is bright, almost citrus-like, and unexpectedly refreshing. You wonder whether this habit is widely practiced or unique to his household. The young man shrugs when you ask. He says he's heard different stories from travellers, but has never found a single answer that matches every region. As another hymn begins, the family sway gently with the rhythm. The melody is simple but comforting, its notes blending with the crackle of logs in the stove. A woman 2 rows ahead closes her eyes and rests her cheek on her husband's shoulder. A child nearby begins drifting into sleep, their head leaning slowly toward their mother's lap. There is a softness to the gathering, a sense that winter's heaviness lifts slightly when voices rise together. You watch as one man steps quietly to a small shelf and adds a sliver of wood to the stove. The flame leaps up and bathes the room in renewed warmth. He returns to his bench and adjusts his wool collar around his neck. You notice him glancing at the windows where frost flowers spread in delicate shapes. He whispers that such frost patterns often appear before the weather turns even colder. Another attendee overhears and shakes his head gently. He says the patterns mean nothing predictable at all. Their friendly disagreement earns a few soft laughs, a reminder that even local wisdom comes wrapped in many interpretations. After the final song fades, the leader invites the group to take a moment of quiet. The hall settles into a stillness broken only by the pop of resin inside the burning logs. Families close their eyes, letting the warmth soak into their bodies. A few people kneel, others sit upright, and some simply lean against each other. You can almost feel sleep tugging at several attendees, the heat and the hush, easing them toward rest after a long day of toil. When the quiet moment ends, people begin gathering scarves and coats. Children shuffle sleepily. Men lift baskets filled with leftover bread or shared winter treats. Women tuck blankets over their shoulders and brush frost from their skirts. Before stepping outside, each person pauses at the stove once more, holding their hands near the flames for one final dose of heat. The leader thanks everyone for braving the night. He bids you farewell with a nod and wishes you warmth on your journey. You step outside into the cold again, struck by how stark the world feels compared to the glowing interior. Yet something about the warmth of that gathering lingers in your chest. As you walk away, you look back once. The building shines with soft golden light, a beacon against the snow-swept landscape. The song's final notes seem to follow you, blending with the night and guiding your footsteps toward whatever winter lesson awaits next. You walk deeper into the night until the land shifts from open fields to a series of low, rolling hills. The snow lies smoother here, undisturbed except for a faint trail leading toward a rocky outcrop. Even from a distance you see movement near the sheltered hollow beneath a jutting slab of stone. Someone is setting up camp on the trail itself, far from any cabin or settlement. Tonight you step into the quiet, lonely world of winter travellers who slept on the open land using only bedrolls, small fires, and the modest shelter provided by nature. As you approach, a man bundled in a long coat lifts his lantern and nods in greeting. His horse grazes from a nosebag, its breath rising like soft steam in the cold air. He gestures toward a small fire, barely more than a ring of glowing coals. You sit beside him and feel the sharp contrast between the exposed night and the faint warmth radiating from the embers. He explains that travellers who could not reach settlements before nightfall often camp like this. Diaries from long-distance riders sometimes describe similar makeshift shelters created by instinct and necessity rather than planning. The man adjusts his bedroll, shaking out crisp folds before smoothing the canvas against the ground. You watch as he inspects the fabric carefully. He points out a thin layer of frozen earth beneath the snow and recommends placing the bedroll over dry grass whenever possible. He says that even a few handfuls of grass create a barrier that prevents the cold ground from stealing heat too quickly. He kneels and spreads a small pile of dried stems beneath his sleeping spot. A detail like this rarely appears in formal accounts, yet trail anecdotes often highlight such simple tricks learned from long miles alone. You study the rock overhead. The ledge is not large, but it shields the camp from wind sweeping down the slope. The traveller explains how crucial this is. He tells you that winter winds can turn a night into misery unless you find something to break their force. A sloping rock, the lee side of a hill, even a cluster of bushes can change everything. Some surviving maps drawn by riders contain small notations marking places like this, spots that offer just enough protection to rest safely for a few hours. The horse shifts, stamping the snow with a dull thud. The man rises and checks the animal's hooves, brushing packed ice from around the shoes. He explains that travellers often listened for any unusual sound in their horses' breathing or movement. When sleeping outdoors, the horse became a guardian of sorts. If predators approached or storms changed direction, horses reacted before humans did. This unspoken relationship appears in scattered oral histories, though details differ from rider to rider. You ask him whether many people slept outdoors during winter. The man shrugs and says that travellers had different thresholds. Some avoided it whenever possible, seeking any available cabin, barn or settlement. Others welcomed the solitude. Letters written by explorers often present contradictory impressions. Some portray winter camping as a test of endurance, embraced by only the brave. Others suggest it was simply routine when distances stretched between settlements. The man laughs softly, saying the truth depends on who tells the story and how cold their memory was. He settles back beside the fire and begins preparing his simple evening meal. He fills a tin cup with snow and holds it near the coals until it melts. The sound of water forming is gentle like distant rain. He drops a pinch of coffee grounds into the cup and stirs slowly. When he hands you the drink, its bitter warmth spreads through your chest. He explains that hot liquids mattered more than food on nights like this. Many trail diaries mention travellers sipping weak coffee or broth simply to maintain warmth long after the fire dwindled. As he eats, he shows you a small pouch containing dried meat. The slices are thin and tough, but they soften slightly when held near the fire. He says he prefers eating just a little before sleeping because it helps his body stay warm. This notion echoes what appears in several frontier memoirs where people described eating small amounts late in the evening to feed the night's fire within. Whether rooted in folk logic or experience, the idea somehow rings true as you watch him chew slowly and thoughtfully. The man then draws your attention to something unexpected, a handful of pine needles bundled in twine that he keeps inside his coat. He unwraps them and tosses a small pinch into the fire. A fresh, sharp scent rises, cleansing the air. He says he uses it to keep the space around him feeling brighter during long winter nights. A travelling companion taught him this years ago. Whether it served any deeper purpose was unclear, but the fragrance certainly warms the senses. He arranges his bedroll once more, spreading the wool blankets and folding the canvas edge upward like a narrow wall. He demonstrates how he tucks his coat around his shoulders once he lies down. The technique is simple but effective. The coat becomes a second barrier that traps heat as he sleeps. His motions are deliberate, shaped by habit and necessity. Every fold, every tuck carries the quiet wisdom of countless nights spent outdoors. The fire begins to dim into red embers. The man kneels and gathers a few small branches to lay across them. He says large logs are unnecessary unless you plan to stay awake. Small twigs allow the coals to last longer, conserving heat without wasting fuel. This approach appears occasionally in the recollections of riders who preferred efficiency over brightness during winter travels. A faint sound interrupts the stillness. The horse lifts its head ears, pricking toward the dark. The traveller pauses, listening closely. After a long moment, he relaxes, likely a deer moving through the brush. You realise that in such wide silence, the smallest noise gains significance. As the fire quiets to a soft glow, he lies down inside the bedroll. He shows you how he places warmed stones near the foot of the bedding, wrapped in spare cloth to prevent burning the fabric. The stones radiate a gentle heat that reaches upward, creating a calming pocket of warmth. It seems almost miraculous in such an exposed setting. He then places the lantern behind a small rock, shielding its light. He says he prefers to sleep in darkness so the flame does not lure unwanted attention. Some nighttime visitors, he remarks wryly, come on 2 legs rather than 4. The hint of humour softens the warning, but you understand the caution. As he settles in, his voice slows. He speaks of clear nights when stars glare so brightly that the cold becomes sharper. He mentions mornings when frost coats his beard before he even stands. He speaks of rare moments when waking on the trail feels peaceful, wrapped in quiet and sky. His breathing evens out. The horse stands like a silent sentinel. The fire glows faintly, casting the faintest reflection against the stone ledge. You rise slowly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of warmth he has created. As you walk away, the night feels immense. Behind you remains a tiny pocket of survival, carved out of snow rock, and the practiced discipline of a man who has learned to sleep where the land allows it, You continue onward, the cold brushing your face like a reminder that winter does not loosen its grip easily. You walk until the hills stretch out into a wide basin where moonlight pools in soft blue layers. The air feels different here, still cold but gentler, as if the wind has taken a brief rest. Ahead you spot a long, low ranch house, with smoke drifting lazily from its chimney. A faint glow leaks from its windows, and as you approach you hear muffled laughter, followed by the rhythmic scrape of something large moving against wood. Tonight you're stepping into the world of winter chores before sleep, those evening rituals that shaped how comfortable the night would be once the lamps dimmed and the blankets settled. When you step inside, the warmth wraps around you in a comforting swirl of hay wool and simmering stew. A group of ranch hands gathers near the hearth, each finishing some task before they can rest. One man sharpens a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Another oils a bridle. A third checks the soles of his boots, brushing away mud frozen stiff from earlier chores. You take a seat near the fire, feeling the heat roll over your chilled skin. The ranch matriarch, a sturdy woman with a braid wrapped twice around her head, carries an armful of sheepskins to a bench. She lays them out and begins shaking them gently. She explains that everyone completes small tasks like these before sleep because neglecting them made the next day harder. In an old letter she keeps tucked in a drawer, her grandmother once mentioned that winter evenings were as much work as mornings, only quieter. Watching the scene around you, you understand the truth in that sentiment. A ranch hand nearby lifts a small tin from the mantel and shows it to you. Inside lies a dark mixture he uses to treat leather. He dabs it onto his gloves, working it into the creases to keep them soft through the night. He mentions that some ranchers kept a similar mixture warm near the stove so it soaked into the leather more easily. That little gesture doesn't appear in many formal documents, but older hands pass the practice along by word of mouth. As he works, a young woman comes in from outside snow, clinging to her boots. She carries a carved wooden trough filled with water. You notice the steam rising from it, faint but steady. She sets it near the hearth, so it will stay liquid until morning. When you ask why, she explains that animals needed water early, long before the sun rose. If the trough froze overnight, it slowed the whole morning's routine. A few farm diaries describe how keeping water warm indoors became a nightly ritual in winter, a simple detail that determined whether chores went smoothly at dawn. Across the room, another ranch hand sweeps the floor with a homemade broom. The straw bristles hiss softly against the boards. He explains that stray bits of hay dust and grit needed clearing before sleep. Otherwise, the cabin became a tangled mess by morning. He gestures toward the corner where boots line up neatly. You can almost picture the chaos of a winter morning without such care. Cold boots, lost tools, and irritated workers stumbling through clutter before daylight. The matriarch calls you over and shows you the sheepskin she was shaking earlier. She explains that these make the bed significantly warmer. She presses one into your hands and you feel how soft and dense it is. She says they place the skins beneath quilts to insulate the sleepers from cold air rising through the floorboards. In a small notebook tucked near the hearth, she has written that her own mother believed the lanolin in the wool added a soothing quality to sleep. Whether that belief holds any truth or simply comforts her, you cannot say. A ranch hand steps in from the barn carrying a small lantern. He sets it on the table, then fills it with oil. He explains that someone always tended the lanterns before bed, so at least one would be ready for emergencies. He gives you a wry look as he mentions that winter nights could be unpredictable. Horse might break a rail, a calf might wander from the herd, or sudden change in wind could threaten the barn roof. Lantern maintenance may seem minor, but according to the regional stories he's heard, many neighbours considered it essential. The ranch matriarch then begins preparing the sleeping area. She smooths the thick quilts on the bed nearest the fire and tosses a handful of crushed mint under the top layer. She explains with a half smile that it keeps the air fresh and gives the sleepers a calmer night. You catch the faint scent rising from the quilts, cool, clean, slightly sweet. She admits she learned the trick from a travelling friend years ago. Whether others practiced it widely is unclear. She has heard conflicting accounts from neighbouring families. Beside the hearth, the youngest ranch hand sorts through a basket of wool socks. He folds each pair carefully, brushing away stray fibres. He tells you that keeping socks dry and warm before bed determined how well someone slept. He points to a small wooden dowel near the fire. They use it to stretch socks gently so they dry evenly. You run your fingers along the dowel, impressed by how well used it feels. Meanwhile, the eldest ranch hand brings over a curious object, a small bag filled with sand. He sets it near the fire so it warms. When you ask about its purpose, he grins and explains that a handful of warm sand inside a cloth pouch helps soothe stiff hands or cold feet. He claims it's an old trick he learned from a travelling sheep herder. You've heard of warmed stones before, but heated sand is new to you. You hold the small bag, feeling the warmth spread gently across your palm. The room begins to quiet as these final tasks wrap up. The broom rests against the wall. The leather tin is capped. Boots sit in a tidy row. The lanterns glow softly. The smell of mint wool and warm sand blends with a faint aroma of stew lingering from supper. The ranch family gathers near the hearth for the last few minutes before bed. They sit in a loose circle, trading a few gentle jokes about the morning's chores and discussing the weather patterns they noticed that day. Their voices flow easily, worn smooth by routine. The matriarch adds a small stick to the fire and watches it catch. She says that winter reminds them to slow down to make space for these small moments before sleep. She dims the lanterns and the fire becomes the room's heartbeat, soft, glowing steady. The beds wait warmly, lined with sheepskins and mint-scented quilts. The ranch hands settle their tools, stretch their backs and bid each other good rest. Their movements slow as the day's pace unwinds. You rise quietly and slip outside. The cold meets you instantly, but you still carry the warmth of that room around your shoulders, the scent of mint, the glow of sand warmed by the fire, the hush of tasks completed. Behind you, the lights in the ranch house soften until they fade into the seamless dark of the winter night. You continue walking the snow, sighing beneath your steps, ready to meet whatever quiet lesson the next frontier night holds. You walk on until the land dips gently toward a wide valley. The snow here carries a faint sheen under the moon, as if a thin layer of frost glass has settled across the world. Far ahead, you spot the dark outline of several wagons arranged in a half circle. Flickers of firelight dance between them. As you approach, you hear low voices and the soft clink of tin cups. Tonight, you step into the culture of shared night watches, the informal rotations many travelling groups relied on during winter journeys to keep themselves safe, warm and reassured. The wagons sit snugly against one another, forming a small shield against the open wind. A young man notices your arrival and waves you toward the fire. He sits wrapped in a blanket lined with coarse fur, his boots steaming near the flames. Two others sit beside him, each tending small tasks. One polishes a lantern lens. Another warms her hands over a pot simmering with herbs. The fire's heat ripples through the space, driving back the night's sharpness. The young man explains that their group is on a long winter trek, and that they take turns staying awake to watch the camp. He gestures at a small wooden board scratched with chalk marks, names lined up beneath the hours of night. Some migration journals from decades past mention similar watch schedules, though the details vary widely depending on who kept the record. Listening to him, you sense how essential this practice becomes when winter magnifies every distant sound into something worth paying attention to. A woman seated near the fire shows you the horn she uses to signal if she notices anything unusual. An animal wandering too close a storm shifting suddenly, or a traveller waking with a chill. She hands it to you, and you feel its smooth curved surface warm from her touch. She explains that her grandfather carried the same horn across another winter journey. Whether most groups used horns or opted for other signalling tools is unclear. Stories she has heard from other families do not always match. The pot of herbs sends up a fragrant cloud. One of the travellers removes the lid and lets you inhale. The scent is grounding, part wintergreen, part something deeper. She says they drink a warm herbal infusion every night before sleep. It clears the lungs and softens the throat after breathing cold air all day. According to her grandmother's memories, small gatherings around a shared pot at night built camaraderie as much as comfort. A gust of wind rushes past the wagons, rattling their canvas covers. The group pauses, listening. Winter winds play tricks on the ear. One of the men stands lantern in hand and walks to the camp's edge. You follow him. He lifts the lantern high, letting its glow spill across the snow. He explains that watch duty is quieter than people imagine. Most nights nothing happens at all, but the stillness itself becomes its own kind of work, a practice of staying aware while letting others rest. As he scans the horizon, he shows you something tucked inside his coat, a small wooden rattle filled with seeds. When he shakes it gently, the sound is soft but unmistakable. He says he uses it instead of calling out when he wants to alert someone without startling the animals or children. Whether this method came from his own family or from someone he met along his travels, he cannot say, but he trusts it. You return to the fire where the others have begun filling tin cups. The warm drink soothes your throat instantly. One traveller tells you that among the people she knew, growing up groups on winter routes did not always agree on how strict night watches should be. Some believed one watcher was enough. Others insisted on two. A few argued that winter made predators bolder, while others remained sceptical. She shrugs, acknowledging that experiences differed, and no single truth fits every trail. As she speaks, the youngest member of the group wanders over carrying a wool blanket folded neatly. He sets it near the fire and explains that the watchers often warm a blanket before handing it off to the next person taking over. That way, the next watch begins with some comfort instead of stepping cold into the night. The gesture is small but thoughtful. You imagine how reassuring it must feel during a bitter winter rotation. Near the wagons, another traveller adjusts the placement of a wooden crate. When you ask, he explains that placing crates or sacks around the camp helps deaden sound and block gusts of wind. He gestures to the arrangement with quiet pride. These methods rarely appear in written accounts because they were more habit than instruction, more instinct than formal practice. A soft cry rises from one of the wagons. The woman with the horn rises and walks over, returning moments later with a sleepy child in her arms. She carries the child to the fire, settling him near its warmth. You see how night watches are not simply about vigilance. They are about maintaining a gentle rhythm through the night, tending both the vulnerable and the weary. The child soon falls asleep again, and she returns him to the wagon. The group grows quieter as the hour deepens. The next watcher stands and rolls his shoulders, preparing for his shift. He takes the warmed blanket, wraps it around himself, and lifts a fresh lantern from the crate. The lantern glows warmly, its light forming a small island of gold against the pale snow. You ask him what he listens for most. He answers without hesitation, changes. Anything that doesn't fit the night's established pattern. A new gust of wind, a different rhythm of hooves from the animals, a sudden silence from the sky. He says a winter night has a signature, and breaking that signature is what draws his attention. The fire settles into glowing embers. People begin drifting toward their wagons or canvas beds. The watchers exchange a quiet nod, marking the shift. Their silhouettes blend into the moonlit snow as they move to their posts. As you leave the camp, you glance back. The circle of wagons looks almost like a small village carved into the night. Lanterns glow at its edges. Watchers walk slowly, their footsteps soft, their breath visible in tiny clouds. You continue down the trail, warmed by the memory of shared vigilance and the soft comfort of people watching the night together, so others can rest peacefully. You walk until the land ahead softens from rigid hills into a long, gentle slope that catches the moonlight like a pale ribbon. The air feels different now. Not warmer exactly, but less sharp, as if winter itself has paused to breathe. A modest cabin sits at the base of the slope, leaning slightly its roof edged with melting icicles that glimmer like tiny glass teeth. This is where you will end your night's long wandering, stepping into a space where winter finally loosens its hold and sleep comes more easily than it has anywhere else. When you open the door, a wave of tempered warmth washes over you, not too hot, not too smoky, just steady. A family sits around a low fire, finishing their evening routine. A pot of water simmers quietly, releasing a faint scent of chamomile and dried bark. A girl sits near the hearth, brushing out her hair with slow, unhurried strokes, while a boy arranges folded quilts on a nearby bench. The father smiles as you step inside and invites you to sit with them. He tells you this cabin stands on a slight rise, catching more sunlight during the day, and that the benefit carries deeper into the night. In an old local almanac, he once read a writer mentioned that homesteads built on south-facing slopes tended to retain warmth better through freeze-heavy weeks. He gestures toward the window where a faint glow from the last of the embers outside still reflects on the glass. The mother prepares the beds with practiced care. She shakes out a quilt patterned with faded diamonds, then smooths the corners until they lie flat. She comments that her own mother stitched the inner layer from scraps of clothing saved over decades. She points to a little square in the corner that belonged to her childhood jacket and laughs softly. These quilts carry stories in their seams, stories you can feel in the weight of each fold. Near the hearth, the father picks up a small clay bowl. Inside lies a handful of crushed root, pale and fragrant. He tosses a pinch of it onto the fire. A sweet earthy scent rises immediately. He explains that using this plant at night helps ease breathing in dry winter air. It appears occasionally in the recollections of nearby families, though some sources describe slightly different ingredients. Whether the variations reflect local preferences or fading memories, no one agrees entirely. But the scent drifting through the room feels grounding and warm. One of the children shows you a small wooden triangle hanging near the hearth. It is carved with careful lines and smoothed by many touches. The boy says they keep it there to remind themselves to brush snow off their boots before stepping inside. Their grandmother believed that letting snow melt indoors at night brought a kind of heaviness to the air that made dreams restless. Whether this belief has any practical effect is uncertain, but the charm remains preserved from habit rather than necessity. The mother begins to prepare warm water for washing. She pours a little from the kettle into a shallow basin and invites everyone to dip their hands. The warmth spreads like a soft pulse through your fingers. She explains that washing before bed helps the body relax, especially after a day of working in the cold. Some families she has spoken with view the practice differently, saving the warm water for morning instead. She shrugs, acknowledging how customs shift from home to home. The father tends to the fire one last time, gently repositioning the logs so they burn low and steady through the night. He says they learned this arrangement from a neighbour, who claimed it kept the room warm without making the air too dry. Whether the technique came from experience or intuition, it seems to work well here. The fire offers a calm glow that lights the family's faces as they prepare for sleep. The girl folds a woven shawl and places it at the foot of her bed. She tells you her grandmother insisted on keeping a shawl nearby in case the wind changed during the night. She calls it her night comfort, though she admits she rarely needs it. Still, the presence of familiar fabric provides reassurance, especially during the longest stretches of winter. The boy opens a small box containing several polished stones. He selects 2 and hands them to his father, who warms them briefly near the fire. The stones are smooth and warm to the touch. The father slides them into pockets sewn along the inside of the quilt. He explains that warming stones this way helps create an even heat that spreads gradually through the night. Written notes from earlier generations mention similar practices, although the positioning of the stones differs depending on the storyteller. The father laughs lightly, saying each family likely believed their method was the best. As bedtime approaches, the room grows quieter. The mother dims the lantern, allowing the shadows to lengthen. The fire's glow softens into a steady orange hue. The children climb into their beds, curling beneath the quilts with contented sighs. The warmth settling over them feels deep and complete, as though winter itself has taken a step back. The father pulls on his wool socks and slides beneath his own quilt with an expression of satisfaction that comes only after a long day's work. The mother tucks the shawl beside her pillow and settles next to him. Their breathing begins to slow. You feel the entire cabin settling into a calm rhythm like a collective exhale after months of hardship. You stay a moment longer, letting the stillness soak into your senses. The fire cracks once softly. The quilts rustle as someone shifts into a more comfortable position. The cabin feels peaceful in a way you have not felt since your journey began. At last you step outside. The cold greets you, but its bite is gentler now. The cabin's warmth lingers on your skin, and for the first time tonight the wind seems to hum rather than howl. Behind you, the family sleeps soundly, surrounded by warmth, earned through countless winter nights. You walk on, letting the quiet world open around you, the sky vast and comforting. And now, as the night settles fully around you, let everything slow. Let the cold fields, the quiet cabins, the whispering wind recede into the soft distance. You've walked so far through this long winter landscape, step by step, breath by breath, watching the way people shaped warmth from almost nothing, how they let small rituals and quiet care carry them through nights that stretched endlessly. You've seen fires banked to last until dawn, quilts folded with tenderness, warm stones tucked beneath blankets, lanterns glowing softly like small suns against the dark. Let those images drift gently through your thoughts, now not as stories of hardship, but as reminders that even in the harshest seasons, human warmth persists in the smallest gestures. Let your breathing follow this slowing rhythm, in and out, slow and easy. Imagine the snow outside, thick and still dimming every sound except your own soft exhales. Picture yourself inside one of those peaceful cabins where the fire hums quietly, the air glows golden, and the quilts carry a warmth earned from long days of effort and long nights of rest. The walls hold the silence like a shelter, keeping the world at bay. Nothing can hurry you here. Nothing needs your attention. Everything is soft, gentle, unhurried. Feel the weight of a warm quilt settling across your shoulders, grounding you. Feel the faint heat of a stone tucked near your feet, easing you toward comfort. Imagine the glow of a lantern fading slowly as its flame lowers the shadows, drifting into soft shapes around you. Let those shapes blur as if even the room is closing its eyes. You are safe, you are warm, you are held by quiet. And when you're ready, let yourself drift down into sleep as peacefully as those winter families settling beneath their quilts, breathing in the hush of another long frontier night.